All right, we've done it. We're here. We're streaming. We made it. What a time we're having. What a time we're having. Oh, I went to a doctor's appointment, an important doctor's appointment, and it has taken all the life out of me, it feels like. I feel extremely drained. I feel extremely. Honestly, life is so draining right now, isn't it? I feel like this is how this stream is going to be. And I think I'm better off just acknowledging it, admitting it, saying it out loud, talking about it, trying to be as forthright, always trying to be as forthright as I can whenever I do this stream. Whenever I talk, whenever I come to this, there is an element of dealing with my own mental health when I talk about this. And I think that people come here because I think it helps them deal with their own uh, uh, mental health when they're here. Content, always a pleasure. Really staying on topic. Give me a mech mercenary company name. A mech mercenary company name. I remember back in the 90s, right? The Super Nintendo game Mech Warrior. And that game was super great. Mech Warrior was a super fun game, and they've never really been able to capture that kind of thing again. Eric, good to see you. I feel like I haven't seen you in a long time, Eric. Good to see you. Real Mech Warrior hours. This man games. Oh yeah, I love gaming. Gaming's the best. I'm going through another Elden Ring play right now because I'm getting ready for the expansion that's coming out, and I want to have a good, solid character. Gabriel, good to see you. Eggs D, good to see you. That Al Jazeera documentary on the evangelical Christians I posted on Discord, they're not really new info, made me feel like shit. Oh, I didn't have the chance to read it, but any chance you get into evangelical Christian territory. Hold on, Mech Mercenary Company name. For some reason, I'm like Jaguar Assault Squad, um, uh, uh, Tin Hat Soldiers, Metal McWar Crimes. Sure, sure, that's a good one. Uh, uh, yeah, I think I'm tapped out of that. Like, unless you want to do GI genocide. Tin Hat Soldier sounds awesome. Yeah, I knew it. I knew I'd get one. DM, good to see you. Yep, it's about evangelical Christian ties with Zionism and time. Jesus will be coming back at any moment, everybody. As long as you continue praying to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, he'll come back. And when he comes back, he's going to bestow you with riches untold into the realm of all reality. You just need to believe in Jesus Christ. And don't you worry one tick whatsoever about this climate change and this the genocides that you're seeing here. Those are all just signs of the Creator's return to the earth through His blood and loving Son Jesus Christ. Yeah, like like, but that shit's real. Like that shit's real. I think one of the biggest condemnations that I actually do have for corporate media is its obliteration of what the culture actually is and what's actually going on in the culture. Like, it's pretty clear that the strategy of the corporate power structure and the corporate state is an attempt to create the culture, right? That's what they're trying to do. Is they're trying to obliterate all other cultures by becoming the culture, and that they can what they present and what they put in front of everybody, that is the real culture, and that is what the culture actually is. And I think that it's we should condemn it. that if news media has any purpose whatsoever, it should be to inform people of what reality actually is, not what you want reality to be. And I think the corporate power structure presents a reality as they want it to be. Because if they were presenting reality as it actually was, they would be doing constant exposés and we'd be having constant conversations. It would be every week. There would be a weekly column in the New York Times, for Christ's sakes. There would be there'd be a weekly column in the New York in the Post. There'd be a weekly column here in Canada in the National Post. There'd be weekly columns and it would be considered completely absurd to run a newspaper like the Globe and Mail, or to have a news station where they didn't do a segment on what's going on in the far Christian right. Right? Like it seems to me like that's an extremely important demographic in the society. It's an extremely important part of what's going on in our society. And instead of engaging in it, we've tried to obliterate it, and we've tried to push it out of the discourse. And what that's done, of course, is it's allowed the corporate power structure to simultaneously obliterate it from the discourse while also organizing with the evangelical right. Like, that's who these far right wingers are. That's who are the Trump supporters are. That's who the Conservative Party is. That's how they're getting their power base, is through this alliance of corporate power with evangelical Christians. That's who is on the right in America. And the right wing Christians in America are lunatics, right? Like they're absolutely like lunatic fringe thinking. Just absolutely demonstrably wackos, and yet we don't engage them. We don't pretend like they exist. It's a significant problem. Like, it's a significant problem in America. And so anytime anybody actually does do a documentary, and anytime anybody does wade into it, and anytime anybody does talk about it, they don't know how to, and they just come out of the thing being like, oh my goodness, like how does this even exist in the society? And what do we even do about the reality that there are people who literally believe that there's a magic book that tells you the difference between what's right and wrong, and we don't need to read that magic book or understand anything about that magic book or act in accordance with that magic book. We just need to believe that that magic book exists through the lens that we are told by the leadership that's in power. And then goodness will be bestowed to us. And if goodness isn't bestowed to you, it means that you've made Jesus sad or mad or something. Like, it's just this crazy ideology that's taken hold of huge sections of the American public and the Canadian public. And we just don't talk about it. Like, it's, and if you do talk about it, you're being insulting, or you're infringing on someone's freedom of religion or any of this kind of stuff. And it's like like there are reasons why things have gotten as terrifying and as scary as they've gotten. Yeah, these are the people behind US foreign policy. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's just kind of like crusader shit. Like, we're not an advanced people. You know, we like to pretend like we have this technological advancement, and and that makes us morally advanced and all of this, but we're like fucking cave people. Like, we're very superstitious, and we believe magic is real. Like, we have these backwards beliefs in the way that we think and the way that we are, and like we're very medieval. Like, we're not this advanced society, and it's starting to show, right? Like, when things are going well, when you're living in periods of prosperity, when you're living in periods where there's lots of wealth to go around and all of this, then, like, everybody, like, okay, you have, like, this kooky idea, sure, whatever, right? And everybody just kind of goes along with their life. But when crunch time happens and the clampdown happens, right, these kooky people, this kooky ideology starts to actually really matter. Because... And what's so embarrassing for the Christians and the Christian right is that their own Christ is like, give your money to the poor, right? His message is extremely egalitarian. It's about stewardship of the earth, and it's about stewardship of the society, and it's about making sure that everyone has their basic needs accounted for. Stories like the 500 fish and the feeding the 5,000, right? These stories get obliterated from the narrative, and instead you focus on uh, um, terrible interpretations of specific passages from specific things, so that you can say gay people are bad. Well, but you don't need to pay any attention whatsoever to when Jesus actually literally says to your face, give money to the poor, right? It's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than, or it's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven. Like, these sorts of statements just get obliterated from the discourse completely, because at the end of the day, modern Christianity is not about Christ, it's about capitalism. It's been supplanted, that the skin is there. The Christians are wearing the skin of Christianity, but it's just money. It's just the dollar sign, right? They're part of the death cult. And so these people, like, if the Muslim world was subordinate to capital, like if every Muslim in the world just bent the knee and said neoliberal capitalism is the greatest, then all of a sudden you would find that all these Christians would be completely understanding of Islam. Oh yeah, we need to focus on diversity and all this kind of stuff because the Muslims have bent the knee to capital. But because the Muslim world is still fighting, for obvious reasons, against the system of capital, then the Christian, it's a crusade and they're an evil satanic cult and they want to get rid of Christianity and they hate Christ and all this kind of stuff. Right? All these Christo-fascists are pushing me to be a Satanist, to be honest. The Satanic Temple does some good tier, God tier trolling in the name of separation of church and state. Yeah, I mean, I think that the trolling aspect of the Satanists is great, but in terms of like a legitimate worldview, you're still defining your worldview through the lens of fundamentalist Christianity. Like, that to me is the issue. Like, I have absolutely no problem with the Bible. I have no problem with Christianity as a mode of thinking about the moral world and having discussions about it. But it's this idea of fundamentalism. It's the idea that I'm supposed to believe magic is real, that like Harry Potter is real. You know, like it's that. It'd be as if somebody really tried to convince me that there's a wizard hiding somewhere, and I've really got to pay attention to the wizard. You know, and like. But these people have significant control, right? And they have this worldview that actually says that things will be better after the apocalypse. Jesus Christ is going to come back because we're in the end times. And it's this end times nonsense that's just getting absolutely nutty. Eric, what are you saying to me, my man? Haven't finished those studies. I'm doing a deep dive on the Palestine conflict and what's happening at the ICJ. Yeah. Yeah, voting for Biden to stop the Republicans is like voting for Hindenburg to stop Hitler. Absolutely. There's about 20 hours of recording of an advisory hearing about the conflict where there was over 50 countries brought their opinion to the World Court. I still have about 3 hours left. Of course, I decided to watch a 5-hour debate between 3 scholars and a gamer that took place last weekend. Yeah, you're referring to the Norm Finkelstein, Stephen Bonnell. I absolutely refuse to call this guy Destiny anymore. Like, what are we, children? His name's Stephen Bonnell, right? Like he's an unimaginably pathetic loser. Like this person is like, he's actually stupider than Ben Shapiro, right? Like that's something that I'm really like, I need people to really grab a hold of. Vestlin, good to see you. This guy, Stephen Bonnell, he's actually stupider than Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro believes magic is real, right? Stephen Bonnell thinks that he lives in this intellectual realm, or that he is an intellectual. Like, he's just some rich kid who got lucky playing video games, who's too stupid to understand that he should keep his mouth shut on a lot of these issues and listen to people who actually understand the issues. And that quote unquote debate, if you want to call it that, really showed you pretty plainly that, like, Stephen Bunnell, if he was alive during the extermination of the First Nations people, he would be arguing in favor of that. If he was in Germany during the Nazi period, he would be on the side of the Nazis. If he was if he was a Southerner during the Civil War, he'd be arguing in favor of slavery, right? His positions are extremely pro genocide. He takes the position of power against genocide, against the people that they want to dominate. He doesn't seem to care at all about the reality of the extermination of the Palestinians, just like he wouldn't have cared about the extermination of the First Nations people or the enslavement of the black population. Right? His position comes from, I've been listening to one guy on TikTok that's been really breaking it down. I forget his name offhand, but he's basically been saying that Stephen Bunnell, his position is one of utilitarianism, that Stephen Bunnell sees people as objects, that people are only as valuable as what they are useful for. And utilitarianism is the ideology of Hitler. It is the ideology of the Nazis, because the position says you should do whatever's the best for the majority, which means that you can treat the minority as if they are disposable, which is exactly what Bunnell does. He treats the minority as if they're disposable and not human, right? Because and that's how you get Nazi ideologies and Zionist ideologies, is you create a nice sounding ideology that says, like, oh yeah, we should maximize the well-being for the majority. Right. So if you maximize the well-being for the majority at the expense of the minority, well, utilitarianism allows for that. And that's exactly what Bunnell argues for. So he's completely fine with exterminating the Palestinian people if it means we get their oil, which is what this is all about, right? This is why they're building that pier. This is why they're doing all of this. They're doing all of this and they're acting in this way, and they're exterminating the people of Gaza, and they're clearing and they're ethnically cleansing the land, and they're pushing them out because there's billions and billions of dollars of natural gas there. There's billions and billions of dollars of resources there, and so they're pushing them out of that region, building a pier there, pretending like it's like, oh yeah, we're going in there we're putting a pier there to get humanitarian aid, right? They're putting a pier there so that they can begin funneling in the resources they need to build the oil rigs and the pipeline that they need in order to get the gas. That's what it's all about. It's about getting the gas, and it's about getting the pipelines built. Like, that's what they're doing there. I'm a bit surprised it's taking anybody any amount of time to put that together. I immediately knew that. The second I was like, oh, they're putting a pier there? Yeah, it's to build a pipeline. It's to make sure that they can build construction projects, right? And in the meantime, you've got dimwits like this Stephen Bunnell guy actually pretending as though what's happening bears any legitimacy whatsoever. So he would have been pro-segregation. He would have been pro, like, what's that famous phrase? There's this phrase where it's liberals are against all wars except the current war. Right? And that's Bunnell to a T. I mean, most Satanists today are atheistic, so the movement kind of has more to do with what far-right Christians are doing while using Christianity as a shield rather than Christianity itself. I mean, it's Satanism is obviously antagonistic. That's what it is. It's obviously this position that says, you guys are crazy, and so we're going to become your enemies. And we're going to be your enemies from the outset. Like, we consider you to be obviously lunatics, and so we're going to present ourselves as your devil, because obviously your devil is better than you, right? You like there was one Satanist that I listened to who he made the argument that he knew more about Christ and he was following the precepts of Christ closer than the Christians were by being a Satanist. Like, it is kind of like responding to absurdism with absurdism. It's just it's responding to lunacy with lunacy, right? And I don't believe the Satanists are actually serious about like I love Satan. Like I don't think that's a real thing. But I definitely do think that like I'm not convinced it's the effective way to go about things. I'm not convinced that it's the best thing to do. Like I think that we can continue to appeal to people's empathy. We can continue to appeal to people's reason. We can continue to say things like, yeah, obviously these texts, like they have magic in them. They're obviously not real. Like it's obvious that these texts are not meant to be taken as literal documentation of a historical past, right? How do we know? There's magic in them, right? Like obviously they're speaking in metaphor, and obviously they're speaking through storytelling, and those metaphors and those stories are important in their own right and say something about the condition of humanity. But to believe, to put that aside and then say what actually matters is wizards, like, and so when you take the position of the Satanist, you're basically just putting your wizard against their wizard. You're just choosing your wizard. And so it doesn't actually advance anything, and it doesn't actually help anything, near as I can tell. So I've got a couple of news articles right here that I really do want to get into. This one right here, I think, is actually the most important thing that's happened all year. And I've actually been really looking forward to talking about it. Jibby Jabby, good to see you. Canada faces a series of crises that will test it in the coming years, RCMP warns. The reason why I think this is a really important article is because it's coming out of our own government, specifically the RCMP, which is the federal policing force here in Canada. Report examines shifts in domestic and international environments that could affect policing. The crises rocking national and international affairs are likely to get worse over the next few years and could have a significant effect on the federal government and Canada's federal police force, says an internal report prepared for by the RCMP. The global community has experienced a series of crises, with COVID-19, supply chain issues, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine all sending shockwaves throughout the world, says the report, entitled Whole of Government 5-Year Trends for Canada. The situation will probably deteriorate further in the next 5 years as the early effects of climate change and a global recession add their weight to the ongoing crisis. The report was prepared by the RCMP's 3-member Strategic Foresight and Methodology team, a special section set up in February 2022. The report was shared with management at the RCMP's Federal Policing Section. RCMP spokesperson Robin Percival said in response to questions from CBC News. The report was obtained through access to information law by Matt Malone, an assistant law professor at Thompson Rivers University, who shared it with CBC News. The heavily redacted 9-page report looks at shifts in the domestic and international environments that could have a significant effect on the Canadian government and the RCMP. Percival said it was written between March and December of 2022 for situational awareness and to inform decision-making over the 5 years following report's completion. It has not been updated since then. The report says it is based on open-source foresight material, horizon scans, and environment scans from law enforcement agencies, government agencies, and private entities, both domestic and international. The report paints a bleak picture of what the RCMP and Canada could have to face over the next several years. The geopolitical, economic, social, technological, and environmental shifts presented here are complex and continue to evolve, the report warns. They can disrupt or redefine law enforcement work and operations in unexpected ways. Both minor and major shifts have the potential to cause multifaceted disruptive change across the organization. Climate change will have a significant impact, the report predicted. Over the course of the next 5 years, environmental scientists expect that increasingly violent and even concurrent storms, worsening drought, floods, and persistent heat waves all over the globe will reduce the global output of a variety of commodities, said the report. Law enforcement should anticipate that these destructive weather patterns will affect all facets of government, including damage to critical infrastructure, increasing pressure to cede Arctic territory, and more. The report predicts that more frequent extreme weather events could have a disproportionately adverse effect on indigenous communities because many of them are located in areas that are warming faster, and the weather events could take place at the same time as other major crises that require RCMP resources. Emergency management planning should be considered by law enforcement decision makers to ensure continued levels of service delivery. Capacity building through the attraction and retention of qualified staff remains a challenge to law enforcement. The one theme that has been going throughout all of this is that people are no longer participating in the fascist organizations. Like organizations like the United States military, the RCMP, like these pretty obvious fascist organizations are finding it difficult to hire people, which I think is good. It's good that these organizations are becoming weakened in that way. Sliding living standards and polarization. Political polarization and resentment, coupled with the threat of an economic recession, will also present a challenge, the report predicts. The coming period of recession will also accelerate the decline in living standards that the younger generations have already witnessed compared to earlier generations, said the report. For example, many Canadians under 35 are unlikely ever to be able to buy a place to live. The fallout from this decline in living standards will be exacerbated by the fact that the difference between the extremes of wealth is greater now in developed countries than it has been at any time in several generations. Like, this is the RCMP saying this, right? Like, the RCMP is looking at the political class, cold, stone-faced, directly right at them, saying, hey, the rich people you serve are fucking everything up for you. And you're just going to keep serving them? Okay, cool. I guess we're a fascist organization. Which, guess what, RCMP? You 100% are. Populists have been capitulating on a rise in political polarization and conspiracy theories and tailoring their messages to appeal to extremist movements, the report says, adding that authoritarian movements have been on the rise in many liberal democratic countries. Law enforcement should expect continuing social and political polarization, fueled by misinformation campaigns, and an increasing mistrust for all democratic institutions, says the report. Well, yeah, because people are being abandoned. Right? It's a system of abandonment. We are being abandoned by our systems. Obviously, people are going to have mistrust for systems that are actively extracting wealth from them and then abandoning them. New information technologies, including AI deepfakes, quantum computing, and blockchain, could also present challenges, said the report. Law enforcement should anticipate that criminals will leverage technological innovations to gain profit and influence. Yeah, like the banking class, the financial class, like Goldman Sachs. Right? Like there's no larger criminal organization in the United States. Well, maybe the CIA, but like, yeah, obviously like the CIA and CSIS and these major terrorist organizations, Goldman Sachs, that exist in the society are going to use AI and technology in order to continue terrorizing people, right? Like that's their MO. And they've been very effective at it. Law enforcement should also continue to contribute to the policy change related to the privacy of personal information, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, digital ledger technology, and more. The COVID-19 pandemic may have faded, but in 2022, it continued to have an impact on Canadian society, says the report. The damage to the economy and to the social fabric of the nation is ongoing, and there is an established opposition to existing and potential public health measures and other restrictions. It says, citing a university study indicating there is more than a 10% chance of another pandemic spreading in the near future. While the report says it covered geopolitical factors, references to geopolitical challenges appear to be among the passages redacted. 2 pages of the report are entirely blank, with the exception of a picture of a globe. Michael Kempa, University of Ottawa Associate Professor of Criminology, welcomed the report and the existence of the special unit, saying the RCMP has been struggling to meet its federal policing responsibilities. They've now got this special body that is sort of scanning major trends and threats to federal policing type issues, presumably with a view to positioning the RCMP to dealing with these types of challenges down the line. So that's positive. Yeah, because we all know what the RCMP solution is definitely going to be like, hey, maybe we should just give money to poor people. Maybe we should get people into houses, right? That's definitely the RCMP's solution. Kempa said the report correctly identifies the challenges the RCMP and the government are likely to face. The only thing that I would think they underestimate is the urgency with which the RCMP must prepare to address these challenges, he said. Kempa said the RCMP doesn't have a lot of time to make the necessary changes, such as recruiting people with the skills needed to address these kinds of problems. This report underestimates the severity of the challenges. Because, I mean, the RCMP's position is 100% just going to be to ask for more resources so that they can just have another tank or something, right? Like, the RCMP's job is not to actually police anything. It's just to make more money for themselves. A disconnect between threat and preparation. Christian Leprecht, a Queen's University and Royal Military College professor who specializes in defense and security, said the section of the report on the challenges posed by new information technologies and the suggestion that law enforcement should contribute to policy change and response stood out for him. That's a highly unusual statement, said Leprecht. This is a hint that clearly there is a sense that the policy framework in this country is not adequately set up for the challenges of everything from safeguarding personal information, artificial intelligence, the connectivity of the Internet of Things, the privacy challenges, and others presented by quantum computing and blockchain technology, and the accelerant that has proven for all sorts of criminal activity in this country. Leprecht said the report also points to some threats that are often overlooked, such as problems with global supply chains and the need to improve emergency management planning. What we see is some of the disconnect between strategic threat assessment and the resources, capacities, capabilities, and political will to posture Canada effectively for what is clearly going to be a very difficult future for this country, he said. So what did he just say? What did he just say in front of everybody? Right? Let's read through it. Because I've articulated this several times, over and over and over and over again I've articulated this, right? And again, who is this guy? A Queen's University and Royal Military College professor, and he just said there is a disconnect between the strategic threat assessment, what's happening, right? Look, what's happening, the problems that we're being confronted with, and the resources, capacities, capabilities, and political will to posture Canada effectively for what is clearly going to be a very difficult future for this country. Or, if I were to articulate that the way I've articulated that, the rich are extracting as much wealth as they possibly can from you. They know that we're in the middle of a crisis, and what they're doing is they're scooping up all the resources and abandoning you. That's what they're doing. That's their strategy, that's their goal, and even the RCMP has noticed. Even the Queen's University professors have noticed that the resources, capacities, capabilities, and political will to posture Canada effectively for what's clearly going to be a very difficult future for this country are not there. Why? Because they don't give a fuck about you. They don't care at all about you, even a tiny little bit. They view you as an enemy. They view you as a threat. They view you as something to be policed and controlled and dominated because they're fascists. That's how they view you, that you are only useful to them insofar as they can extract value from you. Period, full stop. No other further explanation required, right? We're getting it straight out of the mouth of the RCMP. We're getting it straight out of Queen's University professors now, that this is a period of extraction and abandonment, and the rest of the society is starting to fucking catch up with the Canadian commie, who's been calling it for years now. My favorite part about this report, here's the whole of the report, is how they've redacted things. Here's my favorite. I love this. While evaluating strategic advice and making choices for the organization's long-term success, decisions makers should redacted. Like, this is probably the most fascist shit ever. And they were just like, yep, if that gets out, the public will be like, oh, these guys are Nazis. Oh, like, decision makers should set up gas chambers. Like, what is this? What is it? What could be so bad that decision makers should be doing that they had to redact it? Shouldn't we want to see what the advice of what should be done is? Shouldn't we want to see in public what the RCMP thinks the solutions for the problems actually are? Why is the RCMP redacting the information of what they think the solutions should be? What do you think that is? What do you think that is? Do you think that's probably some crazy fascist shit? Decision makers should empower the RCMP to kick in whoever door they want. Decision makers should allow the RCMP just blanket wiretapping. Like, what are these solutions? So these next 5 years are just going to be absolutely fucking bonkers, and everybody knows it, right? Here's an article from Better Dwelling. Canadians were warned about building a housing-based economy. Now they're approaching a lost decade. National Bank of Canada Financial recently wrote to institutions to warn the country's productivity is stagnating. I mean, that's what happens when you deindustrialize the country. Yeah, Just Me is nailing it here. Canada lost over 600,000 manufacturing jobs since NAFTA's inception. Right, the deindustrialization of the country is future generations are going to look at that and be like, "Oh, you guys were insane." Like that's the dumbest, like most bonkers thing that I think any society has ever done. Like, what's more bonkers than taking your industrial base and giving it to another country and then starting a war with the country whose industrial base you gave? That's exactly what we've done. That we took our industrial base and we gave it to China, and then China enriched itself with our industrial base, and then we turned around and we're going to start a war with China because of the industrial base that we gave them. Like, are you guys starting to see how stupid we are? Like, not just psychopathic, because we're obviously psychopathic. That's, like, very, very clear. Anybody who wants to stand in front of me and pretend like we're not psychopathic, I think, is either just the biggest dummy you've ever talked to, or probably a psychopath. So you get to choose between Stefan Bonnell or Ben Shapiro, right? Are you a moron or are you a psychopath? Because those are the only options left if you're actually trying to defend this system at this point. As a result, so the quality of life as real gross domestic product remains at the same level it was 7 years ago, and it's heading in the wrong direction. Measuring the success of your society through GDP is a terrible, terrible idea. And somebody very recently gave me the clearest example of why it's a terrible idea to measure the success of your society or the quality of life of your society through GDP. So, if water is free and you've got a clear drinking water supply, right? There's literally just a lake that's like pure and clean and everybody gets their drinking water from it and everything's completely fine, right? Well, GDP is going to be zero, right? But if you poison the water supply and create a need to actually create filtration systems in order to get clean water out of that lake, well, guess what happens? Your GDP goes up, right? Quality of life, definitely worse. Right? Definitely worse. Your water supply is poisoned. And you have to go through this filtration system in order to get clean water. Right? Quality of life declined, obviously. GDP up. Right? So using GDP as a measure of success of your society is essentially saying, oh, you want high GDP? You should poison your water supply. That'll increase your GDP. Because look at all the work it takes to actually filter out the system. Look at all the activity. Look at the economic activity you've created, right? Your GDP is through the roof because now you need everybody working to purify a water supply that was previously unpoisoned. So if your goal is to increase the GDP, then poison the water supply. That'll increase the quality of life for your citizens. Productivity and real GDP per capita. Real GDP per capita is the inflation-adjusted value of an economy's output, divided by population. We know that rising real GDP is generally a good thing, since higher output tends to correlate with increased national wealth. However, in rare cases, a country's population growth will outpace its output. In these circumstances, the aggregate GDP might be rising, but the economy is less efficient. More people mean more consumption, but a decline means they're producing less. That tends to indicate a decline in quality of life, a mark of reversing progress. Canada is quickly approaching a lost decade of stagnation. Canada is getting close to seeing a lost decade. The chart provided by NBF shows Canada and the US roughly tied for real GDP per capita in 2017, with the US climbing steadily until today. Canada sits at the same level 7 years later, but its trend is moving in the wrong direction. NBF chief economist Stefan Marion points to a quote from Nobel laureate Paul Krugman to explain the issue. Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker. For good measure, Marion also points to Canadian GDP per capita purchasing power parity. The indicator looks at local purchasing power, then standardizes them against a single currency to facilitate cross-country comparison. This underperformance has led to our GDP per capita falling to 76% of Americans, according to the World Bank. Canada ignored productivity growth and got left behind. Canada recently reported productivity improved in the last quarter, the first positive over the past 7 quarters. Unfortunately, this advance was not enough to salvage the year, and 2023 will go down in the record books as the third consecutive annual decline, the worst sequence in the last 41 years. Canada approaching a lost decade may surprise some, but it shouldn't. The country received a number of warnings from prominent agencies that building an economy focused on credit creation and housing isn't sustainable. Rather than acknowledging these issues, the country doubled down on trying to stimulate housing demand. In the process, it also managed to send global investment fleeing for greener pastures in record volumes. The OECD previously forecast real GDP growth that indicated quality of life would stagnate. Canada would occupy the growth spot that Greece did during the financial crisis, but for decades. That forecast is looking generous these days. Radio, good to see you. Like, all signs pointing down, right? All signs pointing down, and with absolutely no one who actually gives a crap. I think that's the biggest thing. Absolutely nobody who actually gives two shits whatsoever. Like, literally the opposition party who's likely to take power in the next election here in Canada, what's their big thing? The carbon tax. The carbon tax, which affects basically just rich people, right? That's all they care about. Because if you're a rich person, you're not affected by the housing crisis. In fact, you're benefiting from the housing crisis, right? Because the value of the properties that you own are skyrocketing. So you're not going to do anything about the housing crisis. Right? What's the only thing that matters to you? Oh, I've got to pay this 1% tax on carbon. Well, let's get rid of that. Right? So they've created a whole movement surrounding a whole bunch of rich people. And what's so annoying is that there's huge groups all over the place that are just guzzling the Kool-Aid on this, who actually think that the carbon tax is a significant issue when it truly is not. Like, pretending like the carbon tax is actually a major issue is itself a sign of deep stupidity. It affects a small segment of the society. The segment of the society that affects is the richest people, the people who pollute the most, the people who have access to be able to pollute the most. So the idea that it's this big, huge, gigantic, major issue is sort of brain-dead childishness. And yet, we're constantly being bombarded with the idea that it's this huge crisis that we actually need to mobilize on a national level, and it's just base distractionism that's only going to benefit a small segment of the society. And who's that small segment of the society? Oh, it's the capitalists. Oh, okay. Yep, to serve and protect billionaire assets and interests. Yep. Did you hear China is doing Did you hear what China is doing to circumvent U.S. sanctions? I mean, the whole BRICS organization exists in order to circumvent U.S. sanctions. I don't know what you're talking about specifically. I've actually got this really great. Do I have it right in front of me? Yeah, this right here. I thought this was really great. The U.S.-China trade war. Who dominates global trade? This starts from like 1980. Like, this to me tells the whole story, right? That the Chinese are basically taking the United States deindustrialized itself, and China is taking its deindustrialized the industrialization of America, and they took it for themselves, and now they are becoming the world's trading partner, and the rest of the world is turning to China because China's not going to give that up, right? Like this is the big difference between what's going on in China and what happened in America, is that because America is capitalist and because it's run by financiers, right? Because it's run by dimwits who literally only care about their own pocketbooks specifically and exclusively, with this ridiculous Ayn Rand philosophy of free market capitalism and all of this trickle down bullshit. They took the means of production and they gave it to a country that's literally standing there saying, we want to seize the means of production. And China's not going to make the same mistake. China's not going to start outsourcing its manufacturing, because China understands that manufacturing, the means of production, the creation of goods, is the beating heart of power. If you cannot create goods, you have absolutely nothing. So China is simply not going to give that away. It's not going to redo the financiering of the American economy. It's not going to create a new financial empire. It's not going to do that because it sees what's happening in the United States because of it. The entire world is seeing what's going on in the United States because of it. Eric writes, they are actually doing contract with Mexico when they're building an industrial part so they can manufacture their goods and then have it shipped to the U.S. Yeah, I mean, like, that's classic. Like, that's classic sidestepping. Old Star Ouija board writes, are you pro-Israel? Certainly not. Certainly not. I am anti-genocide. I actually have some good articles here on that subject because it is worth talking about. NDP motion on Palestinian statehood passes after major amendments. This has actually led to, and even though the passage of this bill has actually led to has been criticized because the bill got completely gutted and changed, it has led to this statement: Trudeau government will stop sending arms to Israel, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says, which is a success. We should not be supporting a genocide in Israel. We should be ensuring that Israel does not receive aid or power. We should divest from Israel. We should boycott Israel because they are obviously the Nazis in the world. Like, very, very clearly, Zionism is a Nazi ideology. It's certainly a cousin. Yeah, Sam Harris is pro-Israel. It's crazy. Yeah, that's not shocking. Sam Harris has always been a pro-Western imperialist. Right? He defended nuclear first strikes. He was one of the few voices that was actually defending the torture regime, the CIA torture regime under the Bush administration. Right? I have absolutely no idea whatsoever why Sam Harris is considered to be a serious or legitimate voice in the world at all. One of the big reasons why I do this podcast is because if a guy like Sam Harris can be taken seriously, I can be taken seriously. Sam Harris is a hack, a fraud. He has written some of the most racist shit I've ever read about Muslims. If you read Letter to a Christian Nation, if if you read Letter to a Christian Nation, his caricature of Muslims is as racist as anything that's ever been written about black people from the South. Like, straight up, like, zippity-doo-dah minstrel shit. And Sam Harris is responsible for it. So the idea that we're supposed to be taking this guy serious, right? That, like, he's always been this way, right? He's always been this way. He's always been a racist. He's always been a bigot. He's always been this way. He's always defended torture. He's always defended war, right? And his position, yeah, the book that took him to prominence, the book that took him to a position where people were listening to him, is called Letter to a Christian Nation. Sam Harris was part of a movement called the New Atheist Movement with Chris Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett, which was like a loose kind of affiliation of atheists that were coming out against the evangelical fundamentalist Christian right, which, I mean, to their credit, is something that the Christian left should definitely be doing, and should be doing with more force than they actually are. But and so through that movement, they have embarrassed the Christian left and shown that there really isn't a Christian left. Like, who are the leftists in Christianity actually standing up to these fascists, right? But very obviously, almost to an individual, I think Dennett might be the only one, but like, Hitchens was definitely a bigot. Harris is obviously a bigot, like, doesn't even pretend to hide it. And Dawkins is also, like, they've used this word Islamophobe. That's the word that they've been hit with, but it's just base bigotry. Like, it's like Islamophobe is such a weird thing to label these guys with. It's like the softest, strangest way to discuss these guys. Like, they're bigots. Like, it's very obvious. If you're like, they're willing to condemn white Christians, but they're not, like, talking about white Christians with the same kind of scathing rhetoric that they would against Muslims. And their major critique seems to be, how dare the Muslims fight back? That it's completely fine for us to go over there and bomb them and destroy them and steal their resources and cause genocides against them. That's completely fine. In fact, that's righteous and true and noble, right? Like, it's based just American white supremacist manifest destiny shit, right? But if they fight back, then they're evil and they're the ones causing the problem. Like, there's nothing more childish in this conversation about what's going on in Israel than when Zionists try to pretend as though the Palestinians are the ones that are trying to, the Palestinians are the ones that are genocidal. Like, you can shut their water off. Like, the Zionists can shut their water off. What are you talking about? Old Star writes, what I like about your lives, everything I have questions about, if I bring it up, you completely shift gears and start talking about it and provide a lot of clarity to what I'm going through. Honestly, that's sort of my whole thing, Old Star. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about as this channel grows, my goal and my thing in this is that I want to talk to people. I want to answer questions for people as they write them in. I don't want to have, like, debate bro shit. I'm not interested in that. That to me is tedious and boring and lame, because I think that debate bro shit is just two uneducated morons talking to one another. But if somebody writes something in the chat and they have a legitimate question, especially if it's about the subject of communism or if it's about what's going on in our society, I want to shift gears and I want to talk to people about that. That's what I want to do, right? Good opportunity to say like, share, subscribe, guys. Hit the bells, hit the whistles, do all the stuff. Tell people I exist. Because, like, that's really what's going to make this thing grow. Like, we know the capitalist structure is not going to make this thing grow. We know that the capitalist structure is going to shut this shit down. Like, we know that this is that as we collapse further into fascism, they are going to become more and more censorious. And we can see that with their TikTok ban, and we can see that with the way they go after journalists, and we can see that. So the only way channels like this are actually going to gain traction or grow in any meaningful way is through word of mouth. That's the real truth. And you like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff. Hit the bells, hit the whistles, do all that stuff. Please consider donating. Like, do all that stuff. That's great. But tell people I exist. That's what really matters. Dragon Fruit, good to see you. Hey, John, someone today tried to tell me that Ukraine can't have a Nazi problem because they elected a Jewish leader. It's the most superficial analysis that's absolutely possible, right? Like, sure, the society at writ large, right? Like, so the society writ large elected a Jewish leader. Great. That doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't mean that NATO can't fund neo-Nazi groups. That doesn't mean that parties within the Ukrainian system are not using Nazis, right? Just because the populace writ large, right? Just because the populace writ large doesn't support Nazism doesn't mean there isn't a significant Nazi contingent. Richard Madden. That reminds me of let's just put this up. What are the main differences between Trotskyists and Stalinists? I'm new in learning about communism. So, Richard, you're going to find from my position, I don't really like the isks and the ists very much. I don't really go for it because I find that, like, especially you have the Maoists, the Dangists, the Trotskyists, the Stalinists, right? Like, you have, and there's this whole history behind all of them, and you're going to find that, like, what ends up happening is people fall into a kind of odd fundamentalism where they elevate these figures beyond the scope of what they are, right? Like Trotsky and Stalin and all these guys were just people. They were just men who had their moment in history and were living in this moment of history. And so I don't really care too much to get bogged down into this very divisive, dividing conversation that surrounds these figures a lot of the time, and I prefer to talk about them within the scope of history and just what they are and what they represent. And who Trotsky and Stalin were two gentlemen who were working with Lenin to facilitate a revolution within Russia. Both were instrumental in that regard. Stalin could be described more as a nationalist, and Trotsky could be described more as an internationalist. That Trotsky had the idea of funding permanent revolution and funding international revolution throughout Europe. So he wanted to take the wealth of the socialist project and of the communist project and begin and take it on the offensive and go throughout Europe and fund workers' councils to continue revolutionary effort throughout Europe. Whereas Stalin wanted socialism in one country. He had a more nationalist view of what socialism could be. And I don't mean National Socialism, haha, Nazis, right? But he wanted to see Russia succeed and not go across Europe and create conflict. And in the end, Stalin won, right? And you can say for worse or ill, or you can say whatever you like about whatever narrative you want to create on that, but Stalin won. Stalin swayed more people to his side, and Stalin won the political debate. Trotsky flees from Russia after this happens, and writes some very prescient stuff, right? Writes some very prescient stuff about fascism, and and also creates the term Stalinist, because the people who voted for Stalin did not call themselves Stalinists. They would call themselves Soviets. And and so the history between Trotsky and Stalin is very poisoned. There's a very antagonistic political rivalry there that ends essentially with Stalin assassinating Trotsky in Mexico. Like, not like literally, Stalin didn't literally shoot Trotsky literally, but he definitely hired a guy. Uh, uh, and to be fair, there's no like hard evidence that it was Stalin that hired that guy. But come on, like there's clear evidence that the two of them had a pretty major rivalry. There's clear evidence that the both of them were trying to do a lot of political chicanery. There's clear evidence that the both of them were constantly back and forth with one another. Trotsky, in many senses, becomes a something of a tool of Western capital to create anti-narratives against the Soviet Union, because Trotsky is mad that he didn't become the leader of the Soviet Union. But if you were asking me what's the like main sharp difference, what's the core contingent difference between the view of Trotsky and Stalin, is that Stalin believed in the idea of building socialism in your own nation without sending it outside of your own borders to cause conflict outside of your own borders, whereas Trotsky saw it as the goal of communists to go outside of your own borders and create conflict in other nations and other countries. That's the key difference. And I do think that that idea has infected the American mindset to a certain degree. For example, the war on terror is kind of that idea, that instead of taking our resources and actually building up our own nation and actually building up our own power and actually helping our own people, we should go to other countries and take the war to them, with this kind of logic of, well, if we don't fight them in their countries, then we'll fight them in our country kind of logic, which is childish, but that's the logic. I think that Trotsky is a very intelligent man, was obviously an asshole, right? Obviously an asshole that people found to be quite insufferable. Don't even listen to Stalin about that. You can listen to Lenin talk about that. And who obviously believed that he should be the leader of the Soviet Union, but who lost, right? And he lost against Stalin. So I think all of their writing is useful. And to me, the great tragedy between Trotsky and Stalin is that after the political loss that Trotsky suffered, he wasn't able to reintegrate himself back into Russian society, and Soviet society. That to me is the great tragedy of Trotsky, because I think that Trotsky would have been more useful to the Soviet Union and more useful to the communist project after suffering a political loss and saying, okay, the people, the workers who I support, the workers who I believe are the heart of this movement, the workers who I believe are the voice of communism, have spoken. They don't want us to create this system of permanent revolution. They don't want us to go across Europe and throughout the world creating conflict wherever we go. They don't want us to be this antagonistic figure in the world. They want us to pull back, build productive capacity and productive force in the Soviet Union, to be more protectionist, to be more protectorate. That's what the people have said. And so I, Trotsky, need to accept this loss, maybe go into exile for a minute, just into silence, right, for a minute, recalibrate, and then come back with this understanding that the people have spoken. But that's not what Trotsky does, right? Trotsky, and in my view, Trotsky very much reveals through his actions that he really was in it for himself. And he always was. Because he wasn't actually interested in what the people had to say. Because if he was interested in what the people had to say, he'd accept the loss. Right? But, I mean, Trotsky is very, very obviously, like, certainly a brilliant man. Like, too brilliant for his own good. Right? Like, definitely one of those guys that was like, that thought he was the smartest guy in the room, and so everybody should listen to him. Right? Definitely that guy. Whereas Stalin is a man of the people. People loved Stalin. Right? Like, Stalin tried to step down as the leader of the country on 4 separate occasions, and the people wouldn't let him. Like, that's my favorite thing to point out when people say of Stalin, like, oh, what a dictator. What a horrible dictator. Yeah, a dictator who tried to resign 4 times. And the people were just like, no, we're cool. We're not going to let you resign. He's just like, guys, I'm so tired. Just let me resign. And I actually think it might have been better. It might have been better for the Soviet Union if they had have actually let Stalin resign and let other people kind of at the helm while Stalin was alive. I think that would have been better for the health of the Soviet Union, and it might have allowed the Soviet Union to survive a little bit longer instead of going through its period of appeasement. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Richard. I do think that the story of Trotsky and Stalin is tragic, and I think that it creates a lot of divides. It's a very divisive conversation. I think it is the most divisive conversation in communism. That people will get really, really lost in the weeds about it and really create like a fundamentalist attitude about it, and not really, and because what will happen is people will read the works of Trotsky, which are everywhere, right? In the West, you can read the works of Trotsky, but nobody reads the works of Stalin, right? So they only really get one side of the story. And they only really learn about the Soviet Union from the perspective of the loser, right? And that's no way to learn about a subject. That's no way to learn about a person, right? I don't care to learn about a person from his adversary, right? Well, I do actually care to learn about a person through his adversary, but I also care to learn about a person from his own writings and from his own actions and from his own position. So I think that, to newbies, the arguments can be distracting. I think the thing to focus on, Richard, really, and I hope that if nothing else penetrates, I hope this is the thing that penetrates. When you read these people's works and when you're learning about these people, understand that they're just dudes trying their best. That very often people get lost in this like veneration, and people get really lost in this like great man of history kind of thing, that like Stalin wasn't a god moving the hands of people throughout, like moving the fate of a nation by himself. He was just the person who was in charge of a great mass of people, and that great mass of people were mainly in favor of what it was he was doing. If they weren't in favor of what it was he was doing, he wouldn't be the leader. So please, when you do your reading and when you kind of learn more about these figures, put that in your mind, that because I find it's very divisive and very destructive when people start to pretend like Trotsky or Stalin or Mao or Lenin or any of these guys are these infallible gods, or should be infallible gods. It's just not real. It's just not a way that, like, of course people are going to make errors, and of course there are going to be mistakes, and of course there are going to be things that happen that are bad. And so don't fall into this trap of backseat quarterbacking and pretending like you could have done it better, because chances are good the answer to that would be no. Like, everybody's trying their best, and shit happens. So that to me would be my big advice. That the project of the Soviet Union, in my view, was wildly successful, massively and enormously successful. I think modern day China, modern day Russia, rather, has a lot to thank Stalin and the Soviet Union for. I think that they have experienced a lot of progress and a lot of prosperity because of Stalin, because of Lenin, because of Trotsky, because of all of these people through the revolution that occurred in the Soviet Union. I would love to, a place like the Soviet Union, I would be so curious to see where that country would be now if it had not been for World War II. That's another thing, by the way, that I really want to point out. When you're doing your analysis, include war in your analysis. I don't know why this happens. I'm shocked to see it every time I see it. Really prominent people with much larger bases than I have, thinkers that have more viewers than I do, for whatever reason, these guys just do not put war into their analysis. And it shocks me every single time. Very recently, there was a fellow traveler is his name, and I think he's excellent. I think that he's an excellent communist, and I think he does really good work. He did a video about Dangism and the rise of Dang. And his analysis, which was excellent, and I think he actually ended up in a pretty good spot overall, but it just didn't include war. It just didn't include the Vietnam, Cambodian, Laos, or North Korean War. It didn't include World War II. It just didn't include war, and I was just shocked by that. Like, societies are built and are affected dramatically through war. And war is something that alters the trajectory of human society in a way that nothing else can or does. And to obliterate war and the needing to deal with war and the needing to deal with societies that are coming after you, right? Like the Soviet Union had to make choices because of the Nazis. And that should be just very obvious. But for whatever reason, people obliterate the Nazis from the analysis. People just take the entirety of World War II and they drop it off a precipitous cliff, and they pretend like it didn't happen or that it doesn't exist. Right? So, and this, I think, is actually extremely common, not just in communist circles. I think that the obliteration of the Nazis from the discourse is extremely common. Very recently, I watched, I know this is kind of a childish example, but I think it's absolutely indicative of what I'm talking about. I watched Superman Red Son, which the whole concept is, what if Superman was dropped into the Soviet Union instead of the United States? And it essentially turns into a liberal propaganda piece. But to me, the real crime, is that the Nazis didn't exist. That there was simply no Nazis. That Superman didn't fight the Nazis. There was no rising Nazi threat from Europe. That Joseph Stalin didn't need to defend against the Nazis. I was just like, that should be considered a crime. It should be considered a crime to create narratives like this that obliterate from the discourse the most antagonistic capitalist force that has ever existed on the planet outside of America. Like, the Nazis were this enormous force, and to pretend as though the Soviet Union and the communists didn't have to deal with that and weren't making major decisions because of it is sinful. It's just wrong. And so I feel like I've really got to hit this point because I see it everywhere. It's constant. Like, pretending as though China was making decisions outside of the specter of war. Like, obviously the Dangists were making decisions during the specter of war. The Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Korean wars were happening on their fucking borders. Like, very obviously they were in negotiations with America to stop these wars and had to make concessions. But modern day communists, when they analyze this, they just obliterate it. It doesn't exist. And I can't tolerate it. It just doesn't I find it to be, like, I don't want to use such strong language, but I do find it to be disgraceful. Like, war fucking matters. And to pretend like it doesn't exist, I'm just baffled by it. Yeah, Eggs D, I think you're right, actually. The pro and anti Dangism conversation easily takes the cake, yeah. He talked extensively about the Korean War and how Korea was destroyed, but somehow doesn't realize that the US has always been looking to do the same to China. Yeah, the US has nukes pointed at the mainland from Okinawa. Yeah, like, obviously the Chinese need to go into a period of concessions to capital. They obviously need to do capitalist appeasement. Like, it's very obvious what they need to do. And they just, and the idea that they didn't need to do that is wild to me. Like, it's just absolutely a wild perspective that, yeah, the Chinese should have just fought a perpetual never ending war. Or, or, anyway, that's the end of that. That's the end of that. From the Kids Network, News Network, or the CUDS, I don't know how to pronounce this, QUDS, CUDS News Network. Famine is imminent and likely to occur by May in northern Gaza and could spread across the enclave by July, a UN-backed report said on Monday. After more than 5 months of war, which have shattered the Palestinian territory and cut off supplies, malnutrition and food insecurity have probably exceeded famine levels in Gaza's north, and hunger-linked death rates were likely to do so soon. The report by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification said. The assessment, a scale used by the UN agencies, regional bodies, and aid groups that set the global standard on measuring food crisis, comes amid global pressure on Israel to allow more humanitarian aid into the enclave of 2.3 million people. Like, the United States has lost, capitalism has lost its credibility completely. And it's not going to be able to recover. Like, it's not going to be able to recover. I Need Yetis. Didn't they murder him in Mexico City? You're talking about Trotsky. I don't remember. It was in Mexico. That I definitely remember, but I don't know. I couldn't tell you, like, the intersection. The thing that I think is, like, the system of capital has given up all its credibility now. Like, it has no leg left to stand on in any conversation, right? That like, communism creates famines. Well, first of all, not really. Second of all, you guys are literally creating a famine in the Middle East right now. Here's the report. Like, all of the stuff that capitalism accuses, like, what we're learning about capitalism in this new era is all of the accusations are confessions. All of the accusations are confessions. That every time a capitalist stands up and says something, it's a confession. That they're just projecting onto their enemies. And somebody who stands up and says that, this system is the most evil and dark system because it does X, Y, and Z, well, they are guilty of X, Y, and Z for sure. And that's becoming, like, pretty obvious and pretty straightforward. So these moments here, Trudeau government will stop sending arms to Israel, says the Foreign Affairs Ministry Melanie Joly. This is a step in the right direction. I'm not confident or sure that Canada's participation is going to actually matter, because I think that the system of Western capital has absolutely lost its mind. I don't think it's capable of rational thought anymore. I think that it is a barbarian, savage culture that is acting like barbarian savages and isn't going to be able to stop itself. So Canada will stop officially sending arms, but they'll find another way. There'll be some intermediary body, or there'll be some kind of circuitous third-party network that they'll go through in order to actually get the weapons into Israel. Because it seems now that the whole goal is to exterminate the Gazans and begin extracting the natural gas and the oil that's in that region, which seems to be the whole point. Like, it's just brutal. Eric writes, the amount of apologia for the Palestinian genocide is incredible. Yeah. Not new, though, right? You saw the same thing with black slavery. You saw the same thing with the First Nations genocide. You saw the same, like every time there is a genocide, you see these things. The major difference is that we're watching it happen in real time through video. Like we're really, the evidence is right there. The evidence is right in front of us. And I think that is what is fueling this whole TikTok ban narrative, right? Which incidentally, go away. Hold on. I'm going to fix this so I can actually read the article. The TikTok ban is absolutely so to protect Israel. It's absolutely to make sure that the main tool that's being used, which is TikTok, the main tool that's being used to spread around news about the Palestinian genocide will be shut down. That's the goal. And it's also to build a precedent that the United States government should be allowed to do this. Like, this is yet another moment that shows that the system of Western capital no longer has any credibility. Get an Naranja on Twitch. Good to see you, my man. Good to see you. Twitch is like shockingly quiet today, so. But I'm not really surprised. I feel like channels like mine are going to be suppressed and eventually be shut down. Yeah, did you see Lindsey Graham telling Zelensky to lower the age of the draft and force more Ukrainians to sacrifice themselves for the empire? Yeah, of course Destiny agrees with him. Like like it's insane what we're doing now. Like I've seen the French news I've seen French news stations talking about sending troops into Ukraine. Right? Macron has talked several times. What do I think about the Schumer speech? I don't know what that is. So I don't think anything about the Schumer speech. Like, I don't pay too much attention to what individual Congress people actually say because I don't pay that much attention to, like, the fake, weird propaganda system that people pretend is politics in the United States. Like, it's getting more insane because it needs to, right? All right, he called for a new election in Israel. That's a bad sign for Netanyahu. Like, Netanyahu has, like, completely lost support in his own country, right? Yeah, he said Netanyahu needs to call an election after the war. Yeah. Like, yeah. Bibi replied to him, said, shut the STFU, mind your own business. Yeah. But, like, Netanyahu's a very unpopular figure internationally now, and the United States is going to go through a period of rehabilitation. They're going to try to restore the image of Israel and try to convince people that they're not actually Nazis, and which has been successful in the past. Like, Germany was rehabilitated, and the Nazis in Germany were rehabilitated, so they feel they can do the same in Israel and rehabilitate the Zionists there. Eric writes, also, the conservative scholar on that panel with Norm Finkelstein, Destiny, and Morel, he straight up told Norman and Morel who cares about international and they don't matter. Yeah, which of course Destiny agrees with him. Yeah. Like, they're nationalists, right? Like, they're very much like Israel for Israel and who cares what anybody else thinks. And as long as the United States unquestionably backs Israel, they can do that, right? Israel doesn't have to answer to anybody except the United States, right? That if the United States actually stood up and said, we're no longer going to tolerate this, then Israel would have to respond. But but AIPAC, the Israeli lobby is very powerful, very influential, and very motivated, and has created this, like, creepy little feedback loop within the society, right? Where the United States funds Israel, and then Israel funds a lobby group, which then turns around and influences politicians that then turn around and fund Israel, right? So you have this creepy little Nazi little feedback loop that creates genocides and wars wherever they go. And as long as the United States is focused on doing that, and as long as the United States is going to continue supporting that, then Israel could basically just do what it likes and doesn't need to care about international law, right? Maybe it's Hamdi, New York City, NYC, 212. F, Western European descendants. I mean, a bit on the nose. F, imperialism. That we can definitely agree on, my friend. Good to see you. Hope you're here to be beautiful, my man. Like, Mikhail, good to see you. The idea that they're going to hold a election and it's going to have any legitimacy whatsoever is like they're just going to put in another Zionist. Like, what's going on in Israel right now is a major Zionist, which is essentially a Nazi country. Like, they are supremacist in their worldview. They believe in the supremacy of the success of their own nation, and they're willing to exterminate people over it. I think the evidence at this point is overwhelming, and we are in a point now where the people who are willing to stand up and defend this genocide are doing exactly that. There's no credibility left. Like, a guy like Stephen Bonnell, right, calls himself Destiny like he's a little boy. He has no credibility, right? He shouldn't be listened to as an intellectual thinker. Just like Ben Shapiro. Like, if I found out that somebody was actually listening to Ben Shapiro to take him seriously, I would immediately just be like, oh, so you have no credibility, right? You cannot be thought of as an intellectual thinker because you believe that it's okay to enact a genocide against another group of people for the glory of your God or whatever. Ham, who are you talking about? Who is they in that comment? Is that Israel? Israel, yeah. They're an extension to Western Europe, just like the US and Canada. I mean, the United States is obviously the beating heart of all of it. Sorry, guys, my nose is just driving me crazy. Ugh. I don't know why that happens. Ugh. Look, Israel is very clearly a military base. That's all it is. Okay? For the United States, all it is a military base. It's not no, it's not even security for the petrodollar, right? Like, it's a military base. It allows, I mean, I guess in that way it is a security for the petrodollar, but it exists so that the United States can exert its influence in the Middle East. That's all it is, right? And it's perfectly positioned. Like, you couldn't pick a better spot. They're dead smack right dab in the middle of everything, and you can't get from the Middle East into Africa without going through Israel. People are having to do all kinds of bending over backwards and circuitous methods to subvert the positioning of Israel. Yep, it's always been of interest to empires. It's at the crossroad between Asia and Africa. Absolutely. To me, that's its primary. Well, not its primary, but it's definitely like a major reason why it is positioned where it's positioned. But also, like, the United States, like, look, like, instead of like needing to go from, like, let's say Greece or Italy, right? Let's say they have a military base in Italy and then they need to go into here and then they got to deal with Syria and like all of this. They can literally just like send stuff into Israel, stage everything on Israel. They can just do what they like from there. Right? Like, Jordan's not going to stand in their way. The Saudi Arabians, up until extremely recently, were fairly pro-American, although the Saudis are indicating very clearly that they're pivoting towards China. They want to live a normal country, has borders open with at least one country neighboring them. I mean, that to me is the reason why the Gazans did what they did. Is that under the Trump administration, uh, the Israelis were beginning to normalize relationships with especially Saudi Arabia, right? So they're beginning to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. Well, if they normalize relations with Saudi Arabia and begin to normalize relations with like Egypt and normalize relations with people around him, then the Gazans are dead. And they know they're dead. And that's just the end of their story, that they'll just fade out and they'll just be starved to death. So they did what they had to do, and what that's done is it's poisoned relationships. Saudi Arabia can't normalize relations with Israel anymore. Like, that's not a serious thing. The Saudi thing is an illusion? How do you mean? Like, what's so sad about this whole situation, right? Is that we're just going to watch them do it, right? We're just going to watch them do it. They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop destroying the Gazans. There's nobody who is actually doing anything. There's nobody that's actually like going into Israel and causing Israel problems. Like every so often, like Lebanon will lob some stuff, or Jordan will lob some missiles or whatever, but they hit the Iron Dome, right? Yeah, even if Saudi normalizes relations, nothing will change in reality. Most of the Saudi population is opposed to it. Well, I mean, now the Saudis are definitely opposed to it. Like before, it used to be that like the Saudis would have been able to actually, like the Saudi princes would have been able to create some kind of arrangement with Israel, which could have led to like military arrangements, trade arrangements, like all kinds of things. Like to pretend like it wouldn't have changed things in the region, I think is wrong. I think it definitely would have changed things in the region. Uh, uh, but now the Saudi princes can't because the populace won't let them, because they're committing a genocide against Arabs and Muslims, and the people of Saudi Arabia are that. And they're not going to just go like, oh, that's fine. That tiny group of Muslims you can eradicate. That's completely fine. Uh, 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 and the hope from Israel's perspective, like Israel's objective moving forward is to create greater Israel. They want to take this whole section and they want to grow themselves, right? And so their hope is that they were going to be able to negotiate with Saudi Arabia to be able to do that. Well, that's not going to happen. Yeah, Saudi Arabia is an autocracy, of course. Like, it's if you actually take a look at polling in the region, the government of Saudi Arabia is very popular. The people of Saudi Arabia are quite happy with the Saudi princes at the moment, right? Like, and I'm not saying that to be like, so that means they're good, but it definitely speaks to what's going on in the region, that the people of Saudi Arabia are actually quite pleased with the Saudi government. And I think it's because for like 80 years now, longer than that, this region has been in just collapsing turmoil constantly, uh, uh, except Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is one of the places. Saudi Arabia is one of the places that has been stable, because I think the thing you'll find is that populations, the number one thing they're looking for, and I think this is true. I think this is just a universal truth, is that the number one thing that people are looking for is stability. That people are willing to tolerate a certain amount of oppression, subjugation, poor quality of life, if it's stable, right? It's only when things are destabilized and they're also experiencing the oppression and the subjugation that they're willing to get into revolutionary patterns. That as long as things are stable, as long as people look at the next day that's going to come and they go, okay, tomorrow will be similar to the day that just happened. Maybe it'll even be a minor improvement, right? As long as that promise is on the table, people are willing to go along with it. Yeah, maybe. Jake from Ghana. Yes, you are correct. We should take all land from Israel. Hand it. This isn't really my position. My position is the two-state solution. I don't think that that's possible anymore, but it is the position that I hold, which is that we should end the conflict. We should end the war. We should probably prosecute the Zionists at the ICJ, right? Just like how we prosecuted the Nazis uh, uh, for war crimes, for their very obvious, very clear acts of genocide and war crimes. But that the two-state solution moving forward is the best way to avoid war. I don't think after this, I don't think the Palestinians are going to accept it. So that leads to a very difficult situation of permanent conflict. But that's the position that I actually hold. Yeah, people don't care what country they live in. People just want a country to live in that's decent. So they won't be in the way of their success, family, and work. I think that there's truth to that. I think that people just want to be able to, like, I think what most people really just want is stability. And they're willing to accept a certain amount of, and people are willing to accept a certain amount of subjugation, a certain amount of oppression in their life, as long as it's kind of stable and everybody around them are experiencing the same sort of thing. And everybody's just, working away, doing what they can. And as long as the work's not too laborious, as long as they're stable. What's happening here in Canada, for example, I think is just a huge mistake from the system of capital, that they are destabilizing their own countries. Like, Canada is becoming very destabilized. And we're starting to see that even within the one of my favorite things that keeps happening. We have big immigration numbers because our birth rates are in major decline. And so we are raising our immigration rates to compensate. And these immigrants are coming in and saying, the cost of living is outrageous. And they're turning around and leaving. They're just turning around and leaving. Like, this is a very destabilizing moment. So destabilizing that even the RCMP is commenting on it. Timothy, good to see you. You ever heard of a guy named John Mearsheimer? Yep, I really respect John Mearsheimer. I find myself to be maybe not in lockstep. That's too close to the bone, but definitely John Mearsheimer John Mearsheimer is definitely a voice that people should 100% be listening to. Canada is a nation that people can live decently. I mean, it's definitely Canada has benefited a lot from its extractionist policies and the colonial period. It gave it a moment of stability that the capitalists are now doing everything they can to put it into decline, right? And that's not to say that it's not to say that Canada is a shithole by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely Canada is going through a fairly major decline at the moment. Housing costs, for example, have made it so that anybody under the age of 35, like if you're under the age of 35, you're not buying a house. Like, that's just off the table now. Rent for for God's sakes, I've got this article here that shows our leadership is so outrageously out of touch. Freeland gushes over affordable $1,700 330 square foot apartments. Right? Like, this is our Deputy Prime Minister, the person who's second in command. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland is gushing about a new 245-unit apartment building in downtown Victoria and how affordable its units are. Hudson House, which Freeland touts as housing for low to middle income Canadians, currently lists its 330 square foot micro studio apartments for $1,700 a month, and one bedroom units for $2,470 to $2,680 a month. This is what this psychopath thinks is affordable, right? And this is what's happening in Canada. Our food banks have exploded. Our homelessness has exploded. There are tent cities all over Toronto now. No, but this is the thing. Is that it's not going to stabilize, right? as much as the government will subsidize or provide housing for the people. There's no indication that that's happening, Jake. Right? Like, I want to believe that too, but I use evidence in my decision making. Right? I don't make decisions based on hopes and wishes and dreams. I make decisions based on evidence, and there's literally not one politician in our entire system that is even standing up and saying the things that you are saying. It does not exist. And if it does exist, please show me, and I'll change my tune. Because this is what our second in command is doing. Our second in command is telling people that 330 square foot apartments at $1,700 a month is affordable. That's what we're doing here in Canada. So, and we're also experiencing, yeah, I think you're right, Dave. Good to see you, by the way. We're also experiencing a major wage crisis. Wages have stagnated significantly, while productivity has skyrocketed. But then simultaneously, Canada is experiencing a productivity crisis, right? Because what we're looking at is a system of extraction. It's a system of extraction. I want to believe that that's a joke, Mr. Mystery, so I'll let that first comment slide, but it's kind of oddly Nazi-esque. I'd rather live in Detroit than East Palestine. I mean, East Palestine, another capitalist success story, right? Completely poisoned, absolutely destroyed, right? Like, Detroit at least has sections of the cities that are safe to live in and that haven't been completely poisoned. Yeah, high-paying manufacturing jobs replaced with low-paying retail jobs. Exactly. Oh, there you go. Yeah. So Mr. Mystery writes, after he writes, well, she is a Nazi princess. Yeah. She'll have you in a concentration camp free of charge, commie. Oh, I guess that's true, isn't it? Yeah. Hey, I won't be paying too much rent while I'm in the work camps. That's fair enough. Some dark humor, but I'll take it. For those of you who don't know, Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi collaborator in Ukraine. So, Canada, while I think it is true that if you were living in Canada, if you were to have bought a house pre-2010, I think that you would be in a good position in Canada and you would be living a decent life in Canada. And I think that that would be fine. But like we are experiencing a swift decline. So swift that, and I've reported on this earlier, right? The RCMP is saying that Canada is facing a series of crises and that we're going through a major decline. And it's going to be significant, and it's going to happen a lot faster than people think. This housing crisis has occurred over a period of less than 5 years. Well, in another 5 years, it's going to get worse. Exponentially worse. Because there is no political force anywhere in Canada that is standing up and actually saying, hey, this is a problem and we need to do something serious about it. That the quote-unquote solutions that our political class are putting on the table are non-solutions that are obviously there just to distract from the actual solutions that need to happen. And and we are becoming the housing crisis is just the beginning. Like, we're experiencing a massive fertility crisis. Like, one of the things, and it's beginning to penetrate, I'm starting to see speakers across the globe talking about this phenomenon and talking about the West from this perspective. Like, our fertility numbers are collapsing. They're at the lowest they've ever been. We're not at replacement level, right? 1.3 takes 2 people to make a kid. 1.3 is not replacement level. This is a major decline and a major collapse, and it's been in decline for years, right? And we had plateaued at 1.6, 1992, had a dip, kind of came up, and now we're in a major, major, major decline. Yeah, and it's worthwhile pointing out that the West is losing its colonies. I think that's exactly right, Ham. Yeah. So we are looking at a major, 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 major crisis coming in these next years. And the solution that the Western powers are coming up with is immigration. But the immigration that's coming in, well, they're shocked by the cost of living. And there's also a narrative that's coming up, and it's coming out of the Middle East and it's coming out of East Asian countries, which is the West is opening up its arms, and it's taking the people from these cultures that these cultures have rejected. So, for example, here in Toronto, there's a huge movement of people called Shen Yun, right? Shen Yun comes from China, right? So, like Shen Yun. The whole pitch of Shen Yun is that it's a dance. Oh, come on. Image. It's this dance company, right? You can see these posters all over the place in Toronto. And it's China before communism. I've gone and seen this. It's a very, like, propagandistic view of how it's essentially pro-monarchical, pro-imperial, of course, anti-communist. And then you take a look, yeah, you have them there in New York City, yet they've got a sister company in New York, right? So these people, they came to the West when they were thrown out of China because they're owned by a cult called Falun Gong, right? And the Falun Gong cult, here's their symbol. They're a racial purity cult. Started in the 90s. Here's their symbol. You can see it. Very obvious. Not going to keep it up on the screen for very long for the obvious reasons. Right? And so what's happening is that we here in the West are getting the total freaks and the rejects from other cultures that are getting tossed out. And then we're having to deal with these freaks and rejects, and we're just gullibly believing the nonsense that they're spreading, and we're only doing that because they happen to be in opposition. Like Falun Gong is in opposition to China. That makes them good. No. Maybe there's a reason they got thrown out of China. And so now we've got these weird Nazi groups and these weird Zionist groups. And we've got things like Operation Paperclip, where we literally took Nazis and just rehabilitated them here. That's how you end up with a Nazi being honored in our parliament, right? And so we've got huge sections of our society that are just filled with these racial purity cults and these weird kooky losers spreading obvious propaganda into the society, turning us into dimwits. So that when we look out into the world, instead of saying like, oh, there's a culture that we should learn something from and maybe talk to, we see communism is bad. They're so bad because they're communist. Communism always fails. I saw it in a dance. Like, we're just very, very, very stupid. Yeah, June writes, Marxism in practice is the best refutation of Marxism in theory. Says, yeah, Hitler. Right. Like, yeah, we find a terrible contradiction between its Bolshevism theory and its practice. Its theory is glowing and grandiose, but it carries poison in its attractive gloss. Joseph Goebbels. And then you can add, the problem with socialism is that you run out of other people's money. Margaret Thatcher. Right? You might as well put her in that company too. Like, I think people are starting to recognize and starting to realize that neoliberalism is just fascism repackaged. Like, that's all it is. Like, it's not, it isn't actually different. Like the only thing that neoliberalism has changed from fascism is its proclivity to segregate races, right? So it's not Nazism, right? And and it is trying to differentiate itself uh, uh, from other racial segregationist ideologies, but it's failing, and it's no longer able to sustain itself. Because fundamentally, if you're going to follow a fascist economic structure, you're going to end up with class systems, and you're going to end up with systems of oppression based on class, and ultimately that's going to be based on race. Yeah, the Labour Party said they're bringing back Thatcherism. Yeah, I mean, might as well just keep failing, right? Like the UK is exactly the perfect example of what's going to happen in our societies. Like the UK is an exact example of just extractionism. Oh my goodness. I was told of writing in an essay 30 years ago. I was told off writing in an essay 30 years ago calling liberals fascists without gas chambers. I mean, they just use other methods. That's all. You don't need to create gas chambers. Like, so much of what liberals have been doing since the Nazi period has just been overseas, right? Like, so you don't need to create gas chambers if you're just gonna, have death squads go throughout other people's societies. Like, if you just have the CIA march a death squad through the streets of Afghanistan, gunning people down in the streets, like you don't need to have a gas chamber, right? Like the whole point of having those concentration camps was to exterminate people from your society, was to ethnically cleanse people from your society. Well, modern day liberals don't care to do that, right? Modern day liberals are about uh, destroying other countries, increasing immigration so that people flee from the destruction that they wrought in those countries, and which creates cheap labor, slave labor in their own society, right? That's the whole point. What type of liberalism? I mean, there is only the one type. Yeah, the communism sounds great in theory, but in practice line that liberals like to use was either invented or regurgitated by Nazis, for sure. No, no, and it pays to remember, guys. Like, it pays to remember Nazis were capitalists, right? Like, Nazis were capitalists. That the rise of the Nazis and the rise of fascism is a response to communism. That what was going on in Italy before Mussolini showed up was an enormous threat, an enormous, enormous, enormous threat to the system of capital. That workers' councils were beginning to show up all across Italy. Workers' groups were seizing controls of factories. There was an enormous communist movement that was happening in Italy at that time. And the system of capital knew it needed to respond to it. And so it funded a whole austerity movement through its own university systems across Europe, created and funded political movements, including the fascists, in order to destroy the communist movement. Like, that's what they did. And they didn't do that because communism wasn't working. They were very aware that communism was working. They were very aware that the factories that the communists had taken control of were just as, if not more, productive. They were very aware that the system was working. It just excluded them. That was the problem. It was a major threat to the power of capital and to the power of capitalism, because it meant that capitalists couldn't use these laborers as their own. It meant that the slaves were set free and that the slaves could control their own destiny. And that was the problem. And so the fascists and the Nazis were funded by Western capitalists in order to exterminate and attack the fully functioning and very successful communist projects that existed in their own countries. Very famously, Henry Ford is the man who provided the engines to the Nazi war machine. Without Henry Ford, the Nazis didn't have a war machine. They didn't have war vehicles. So Henry Ford was awarded the Iron Cross from the Nazis for that. For God's sakes, Hitler was Times Man of the Year twice in America. So the American capitalists were pro-Nazi from the outset. And the only reason the Americans actually get involved in this war at all, landing troops here, is because the Soviets defeated the Nazis on the Eastern Front. And the Nazis were being pushed back. And the Nazis were writing about their defeat. And the Nazis were saying that they were fleeing and that they were losing and that the Soviets were going to come and take all of Europe. So America knew that if the Soviets took all of Europe, that was going to be a major success for the system of communism. And they couldn't have that. And so they invaded and they pushed in and they met the Soviets to prevent the Soviets from taking the rest of Europe. That's the reason why America invaded. They didn't invade to defeat the Nazis. They invaded to stop the spread of communism. That's what they were doing. Yeah, and the capital of the American industrialists and the English imperialists rebuilt Nazi Germany. Yeah. No, like capitalism has always been pro-Nazi. And there's a good reason for it. Right? Like, we use the Nazis as, like, the worst of the worst, that they're the apex of all things, but the Nazis wrote of American segregation that it went too far. Like, the Nazis wrote that. They said of the American system that the American system of Jim Crow segregation was too far. Like, that's the Nazis. So America has always been like a fascist Nazi state. So fascist and so far in the direction of Nazism that the Nazis said it was too far. Less than two years ago, the majority of Westerners believe Falun Gong is this quaint little religion that was persecuted by the CCP. Yeah. But now much more people realize they're a cult. I mean, if more people realized it, they wouldn't be allowed to function, right? Like, they're a racial purity cult. Like, that's what they are. And the idea that they're allowed to spread their bullshit propaganda into our society unopposed, to me, is just gross. Like, it's genuine, like, and the whole, like, free speech. Like, go fuck yourself. Like, this is a disgusting ideology that you're spreading into the culture. So there's but the thing is that we have no principles, right? Like, this is the part about Western society that people don't really want to acknowledge. We have this whole, like, free speech, anybody can say what they want. And yeah, that's true if you have no principles. If you have no principles and you have no basis of morality and you have no feet planted on the ground and you don't know the difference between right and wrong, then you can just say anybody can say whatever they want because you don't care. It doesn't matter to you what gets said or what doesn't get said because your ideology is might makes right. I have the guns and so you can say what you like, but I'll shoot you. Like, that's our position. Eric writes, well, since I'm over COVID, I'm now planning to go back to school, start the process to get my master's doctoral thesis, where I want to prove how neoliberalism is Nazism rebranded. Good for you, Eric. Good for you, man. That's the kind of thing that I would get up to if it wasn't so fucking expensive. Like, it's just like you're going to be $100,000 in debt to do that. Just Me writes, we can see how far the liberals have moved since Mulrooney. The old liberals were against everything Mulrooney did. The new liberals are praising him. I mean, I don't believe that the liberals ever were opposed to Mulrooney. Like, I think that they were opposed to Mulrooney in public. But it's not like they pulled back on anything he did. Like, the Chrétien liberals were in power for years and years, like a full decade. Mulrooney destroyed his party. Right? The Conservative Party here in Canada was decimated down to 2 seats. 2 seats. Like, that's a decimation of the party. The Conservative Party had to rebuild itself from nothing, from total scratch. That's where Stephen Harper came from. Stephen Harper came out of the Reform movement. Because for a period of time, there was another political party in Canada called the Reform Movement, led by a fellow by the name of Preston Manning. His right-hand man for a while, Stephen Harper, right? And at the same time that the Reform Movement was building, so too were the Conservatives, and they went through a merger at one point where they actually merged forces in order to try to gain power, which was essentially a merger of the evangelical Christians and the corporate power structure in Canada under Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper's election into the majority position in Canadian politics is actually like if you forget about his politics for a second and you just look at the trajectory that he took, it's actually an incredible story. Stephen Harper is an incredible politician and an incredibly astute, and should definitely be listened to, even though he's a fucking nut job. Obviously, pro-Iraq war, literally thinks that impoverishing people is fine as long as it makes other people wealthy. That kind of shit. And like, while that was going on, the Liberals had majority power for a decade. Like Jean Chrétien, so like one of the longest sitting prime ministers in the history of Canada. If they wanted to regress and they wanted to take away any of this Mulroney era shit, they could have easily done it. Completely unopposed. Literally no one was there to stop them from doing it. Like the NDP had built enough force to become something of a threat from the left, but after Tommy Douglas died, the party basically fell into stagnation and got taken over by corporate power. And so the left was completely hamstrung. The right was dead. All you had was these liberals, and what did they do with it? Basically just fucked us all over. Basically just sat on their ass and just watched the country fall into a total decay. Because they didn't give a fuck. Because it didn't matter to them. Right? Like the ruling class of our society never gave a fuck about us. We're just cattle to them. And the whole goal was the extraction of wealth. And the Liberals were never going to be opposed to that. So, like, yeah, they might have opposed it publicly, but they never did fucking shit about it. Right? No, you can never trust a Liberal. You can never trust a Liberal. Like, it doesn't matter what they say. Like, a Liberal could suddenly start quoting Marx and could suddenly become, like, the most, like, anti-landlord person and could start to espouse whatever value whatsoever. If they're willing to call themselves a liberal, they should not be trusted. They're less trustworthy than a conservative. Like, at least a conservative isn't willing to lie to you. A conservative will look right at your face and be like, you're a worthless piece of shit. Work harder. Just work harder, you fucking lazy loser. You're in the position you're in because you're a lazy asshole. Work harder. Get a job. Right? Like, at least that's honest, even though it's, like, dead brain henchman behavior. But, like, but at least they're telling you the truth, even though they're, like, demonic. Like, a liberal is just lying straight to your face 100% of the time. He's just telling you what you want to hear so that when they get into power, they can just betray you, which they do every single time. So you can't trust these guys. Eggs D writes, Guns N' Roses, back then, even wrote a song called Chinese Democracy, which gave a shout out to the Falun Gong. Gross. That's actually super gross, dude. Like, that's super gross. Like, imagine looking at Falun Gong's symbol and just being like, that's a normal, what a normal, totally normal. Right, this is the Falun Gong emblem. Here it is, totally normal. But John, don't you know, the swastika is actually a Buddhist symbol. It was a Buddhist symbol, you know, and it's an Eastern culture. So they're just using it as Buddhist. It was created in the 90s. Shut up. Like, shut up. Like, it's what a dead brain take. I'm so over this shit. That's Nazism. And if you think it's anything other than Nazism, you're stupid. Like, And so for a group like Guns N' Roses to do a shout out to a Nazi organization, just fucking gross as shit. Long Defiant writes, "It's time to bypass capitalism and create dual power. If you and your community become food independent, it's a big first step to deconstructing the system." That's the goal. That's what Burkina Faso is doing, right? I've got a video here where the leadership of Burkina Faso is basically saying outright that they need to gain food sovereignty, right? Hey, have we talked about the conservatives unanimously voting in favor of genocide? Yep. Hey, that guy. Good to see you. Like, food independence is going to be the the future of all of this. That towns, localities, municipalities are going to have to become food independent because the system of capital is going to starve them, basically. Oh yeah, the French are so mad. They should be. Well, I mean, I hope the French die mad. Like, that's fine. Yeah, become housing independent, become security independent, become educationally independent. Yeah, deconstruct the system or erect a parallel system. Right? Stop trusting in this system. Don't let this system educate your children. Don't let this system touch any part of your life that like get everything that you have and everything that you're building. You should be funneling it into a parallel system that runs separate from the system of capital to the best that we can, because that's how this whole thing is going to, like, we're looking at a massive, major disaster coming our way, and it's going to be a major catastrophe that's going to come our way. The Liberals are putting the disability benefit back until after the next election. My disabled friends are yelling at them to vote Liberal. Like, I'll never vote for them. Really think about what it is the Liberals are doing there. Right? They're using your ability to have food and shelter as a disabled person on disability as a brokering chip in order to get your vote. Like, that's disgusting. That's disgusting, disgraceful behavior. Right? If the Liberals were actually your friend, they would be putting in that kind of legislation and they would be pushing it into a corner and they would be saying, and there it is, and it's going to stay there forever. That will redress this in 558,000 years. They'd literally write that into the legislation. That, like, this, we are tying the disability benefit to inflation. We are ensuring that it is set at this level. A person who is on the disability benefit, we are saying that their rent can only be pegged to this. Like, they could do all kinds of things and then basically just say, and that's the way it is. Send it out and be like, there we go, boom, done. But they're not doing that. They're using it as like a chip. It's gross. It's just fucking gross. And like, this is the thing that's getting me these days, man. Like, looking at the news, looking at everything, like, it's just gotten gross. Like, we're a gross society full of just absolute deplorable assholes who, like, whenever I take a look at the carbon tax conversation, I'm like, what a bunch of gross assholes who literally only give a shit about the $50 a year they have to spend on this carbon tax. Like, what a bunch of gross people who do not give a fuck about anything other than themselves. Like, we're just a culture of selfish assholes. Like, we don't give a fuck about anything. And so it's making everything so tiring. It's making it tiring to want to talk to people. It's making it tiring to want to interact with anybody. It's making it tiring to date. Everything is just so exhausting because everybody's just a selfish, self-entitled asshole who doesn't give a fuck about anything. Like they're literally just like alive to consume and shit, and that's it. Yeah, the Liberals also scrapped election reform because they think it will help fringe group get elected, call themselves Democratic. Yeah. Yep. Did you hear that Putin was elected with 83%? Was the election legitimate, or did the Russians rig the election? Of course, the election was legitimate. Like, it's extremely common that a wartime leader is reelected with a lot of support. That's an extremely common, like, truism throughout all time. If you actually listen to the people who voted for Putin, like, we've interviewed them. Like, you can find them on the internet. I've seen them. People's point is basically they're looking for stability. That's it. And Putin, for all his foibles and faults, he seems to be bringing stability. Right? The people of Russia are quite happy with the war. They're quite pleased with how the war is going. They're happy that he did it, right? Because he could have not. Like, this is the thing that I think is not well understood about Russia and the West, is that the Russians wanted Putin to fight that war, right? Putin did not want to fight that war. He did it because the people wanted him to, and that there was a threat to his power coming up from the communists because of it. And so he said, okay. And he didn't want to do it. And so the people of Russia are quite happy that he's doing it. And they're happy that he's doing it because there were Nazis shelling ethnic Russians on the border of Russia. And then on top of that, Putin's winning. And it looks to anybody with a brain in their head that Putin's going to win this thing. So I think that people, that if you're going to make the claim that the election was illegitimate, you better have some significant evidence to back that up. Like, you better show me how that was an illegitimate election. Because, like, it's not like there was no opposition. Right? And if it was an illegitimate election, then, well, where are the voices coming out of the opposition parties saying that it was illegitimate? Right? Like, where is any evidence for this claim? Like, sure, the CIA says that it's illegitimate. Okay. So to me, that's evidence that it is legitimate. Like, if Western capitalism is going to say that it's an illegitimate election, then I treat that as negative evidence, right? I go like, oh, the West says this, so that's proof that the opposite is true. And until I see actually something that's serious and something that's legitimate, because the truth is that I think most people are just looking for stability. Yeah. And Mr. Well, the National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA outlet, polls Russia every year. Yeah, they predicted the results. Yeah, and the exit polls, like, the reality is, I think Putin is popular. I think that's all. I think that he's an astute politician who is trying to do right by Russia. I don't think he's not a communist. Right? He's not like a socialist by any stretch, but I think he's a realist. I think that he looks at what's going on in his society and says, like, okay, like, so for example, one of the things that's not reported at all that happened under Putin is they had a constitutional referendum. And Putin was heavily criticized in Russia during this constitutional referendum because he put in legislation that allowed him to continue running for president. And so, of course, he's heavily criticized for this. And you could see it in the polls. His popularity declined over that period of time, right? But he also included legislation in the Constitution that says the minimum wage can never drop below a subsistence wage. Like, that's in the Constitution now. Is there anything like that in the United States, Canada, throughout Europe, where that's in the Constitution that says that the minimum wage can never drop below a subsistence wage? Like, and it's not flowery language that got used. It's a one line. The minimum wage can never drop below a subsistence wage. So it's a and so Putin is one of these leaders that, like, every leader can be critiqued for every leader does good things, and every leader does fucked up things, and and so if you hyper focus on the fucked up things and you only focus on the or vice versa, you only focus on the good things, then you got a very incomplete picture of who the person is. Yeah, after Putin finishes this next term, he will have spent 33 years as president. Democracy has been put on ice in Russia, which is better than throwing it in the garbage. But I mean, if you look at the history of Russia, that's common, right? Like, Russia doesn't have this same fetishization of democracy, right? Like, Russia's not sitting there crying out, like, worshiping the founding fathers as democratic. Like, they don't have this connection. They don't try to tie it back to the Roman Senate and, like, all this kind of stuff the way that we do, right? Like, they went from being a monarchy to being to the communist era with, like, workers' councils and the Bolsheviks and this whole thing, to the system they have now. And steadily throughout all of that, the thing that the Soviets seem to care most about is stability and steady improvements to their own society. Like, Russian society has a universal healthcare system. Russian society has social support systems. Like, in terms of, like, its social welfare, it's head and shoulders above America, right? Of course, when America lampoons or criticizes Russia, they'll go to the bombed out areas, the areas that experienced, like, World War II level warfare. But, like, they'll never. Yeah, but Navalny died in, like, as if Navalny is actually a serious political figure. The guy is essentially organizing with neo-Nazis, ends up in prison for fraud. Like, fuck Navalny. Like, he's obviously a political pawn and a political stooge used by the West. The idea that anybody gives a shit about this guy at all. Like, who gives a fuck about Navalny? He died where he should have, which is in prison, as a fucking Nazi. XD, don't kick that pot. Don't kick that. Although, just me, it is an interesting point. You're like, no war, cross out. No, it's like that scene from The Office where he's like, don't, and then he crosses it out, and they're like, but that means do. Anyway. Yeah, Putin overseeing massive social spending projects in healthcare, housing, education, social care. Yeah, because here's the thing. Here's the major difference between the United States, the system of capital, and what's going on in the rest of the world, okay? Is that the entire rest of the world understands that if the point is to build a society, then the best way to go about doing that is to do it. And there are different systems, and there are different methods, and there are different ways to facilitate that, and there's different positions, and there's different avenues, and there's different structures that you can achieve that goal. But as long as your goal is to build the society, and the way to do that is to build it, then you're probably going to have a certain degree of success at that, right? So if you're like the Chinese communists and your goal is to actually build the society, well, they build it. They actually hire people and they take infrastructure projects and they build their society. The Russians do the same. And there's been smatterings of that throughout the history of Europe and Canada, right? The New Deal happened in the United States, where there were moments throughout Western capitalism where we went, oh yeah, the best way to build a civil society is to build it. But now the ideology that's taken hold is this libertarian brain-dead bullshit, this Murray Rothbard, Ayn Rand garbage that says the best way to build a society is to destroy it. And you could see Argentina, for example. Argentina just voted in this absolute lunatic whose entire platform is the best way to build a society is to destroy it. And what he's done is increased poverty in his country by 50%, inflation by 200%, while trying to give himself a raise. And this is the ideology that's dominating Western capital right now, and it's failing. Because the base precept of the best way to build a civil society is to destroy it, well, guess what? It doesn't work that way. If you want to build a society, you do it by building it. And this is the reason why the West is facing the catastrophes that they're facing. Because they refuse to acknowledge that they should build something. And what makes it even more pathetic, especially in the United States, like I've got an article here that says we're in a new gilded age, right? We're in a new gilded age, and I make the argument that we're actually way worse than the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age at least had the wealthy in the Gilded Age actually spent their money doing stuff, right? They actually built things. They created projects. Right, things like Grand Central Station was built. The Carnegie Hall, for God's sakes, they would build these enormous infrastructure projects, and they took their wealth and they did something worthwhile with it. Our billionaires are worthless, worse than worthless. They build nothing that matters. Their projects are pathetic and fail. They waste everybody's time and energy. They do nothing that lasts, and they have no legacy whatsoever. They build gigantic super yachts, enormous vanity projects that are for nobody but them, to build a little toy for a moment before they throw it in the waste bin of history. Like, our billionaires are pathetic losers. Like, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are losers. Pathetic, garbage billionaires who achieve nothing and seek to achieve nothing. That's the best part about them. Is that they're not even trying, like, they're quote-unquote philanthropy. And then when you crack open their philanthropy, it's just another business. It's just another way to harvest money out of the society for themselves. They're not building structures. They're not building libraries. They're not building subways. They're not building anything that matters whatsoever that's going to last for any amount of time. We still have the infrastructure that was built by the people who were building things during the Gilded Age. The second Elon Musk dies, his legacy dies with him. He has built nothing. He stands for nothing. He is a complete and total grifter con man who is pathetic and worthless. Just like Bezos, just like Buffett, just like Gates. Their entire name will be scrubbed from our memory the moment they die because they've built nothing. They're worthless. Like, what a pathetic society we have. What a pathetic, useless people we are. That we've allowed these complete and total losers who have achieved absolutely nothing in their lives to seize control of our society, to build nothing. Like nothing. Meanwhile, China is building hundreds of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail. When Xi Jinping dies, that rail system will last hundreds of years past his death. His legacy will be written on the face of China for centuries. Like, That's a legacy. What have our leaders achieved? When Justin Trudeau dies, who's going to give a fuck at all? He'll probably have his name in a library or something. We'll be like, oh yeah, the Justin Trudeau Library. Yep. Used to be called the Vince McMahon Library. And they just took off that name and put up his name. He didn't even build it. Yuckles. Like, what a worthless group of losers we are. Like, in 100 years, India is going to be like an economic powerhouse once more. Because India is looking over at China and going like, holy shit, that worked. Holy goddamn shit, we got to do that. And they are. Like, when Vladimir Putin dies, he's going to leave behind a real legacy that's actually going to matter to the people of Russia. And people are actually going to talk about him. What's Joe Biden's legacy? The genocide. That's his legacy. The genocide. Like the genocide of the Gazans, the extraction of wealth from the Gaza Strait. Like this loser society full of just loser wealthy people who just essentially jerk off with their money. They're just essentially total jerk-offs who will be forgotten the minute they die. Like, Jeffrey Epstein is going to have a bigger legacy than Warren Buffett. Like when what's his name, Charlie Munger died, nobody gave a fuck. Charlie Munger died, okay. Moving on. Who gives a shit? These people are pointless. Yet the irony being that one of the things that made America what it became was the building of the railway connecting the coasts for the gold diggers. Yeah, and they basically built that infrastructure, and it's where it still is. They've never updated it. Like, why don't they do big passenger travel across the United States through rail? Why don't they do rail passenger trail? Because then people would actually see the state of the rail infrastructure, and they'd be like, oh my God, this is embarrassing. And it is embarrassing. Americans should be embarrassed if they're capable of it. Yeah, Eric writes, my aunt thought it was crazy for me to say Putin's actually doing something extremely good for his society while we are doing nothing. I mean, but it's objectively the truth. Like, this is the problem, is that we're so, like, head up our ass in propaganda land that we don't want to actually take a look at the evidence. We don't want to actually take a look at what's really actually going. Like, we're so hyper emotional, and we're so we just exist in this emotional space that says that what I feel, like, and it's so great that it's the people who are saying facts don't care about your feelings that are the most susceptible to this, who are so obviously driven by their emotions that they don't want to actually look at the evidence, and they don't want to actually look at, like, maybe the best way to build a society is to build it. But if a Western government starts to do that, then that's authoritarianism, right? If a Western government starts to actually build something and starts to actually be effective and starts to actually achieve something, then it's authoritarianism, and that's bad. Like, we're so susceptible to these brain-dead buzzwords, and we have an education system that completely just turns kids into just brain-dead stooges. Just people who cannot put two and two together on this shit. And it's like, so from their inception, it's like a total wash. They're totally fucked. We waste their time teaching them garbage that they'll never use in their real life, because the whole point is to just teach them the most important thing, which is to do what they're told. Just do what they're told, right? Don't actually teach them critical thinking. Don't actually teach them problem solving skills, insofar as they need to figure out how to solve the problems that capitalists give them. And the only problem that a capitalist will ever give any of these kids is make more money for me. become an entrepreneur, solve the problem of making more money for me, right? I can't even be arsed to come up with ideas for how to make more money for me. Now I'm outsourcing that to you. Make more money for me. Oh, you want to do something other than make more money for me? What are you, a communist? You don't want to be a communist. We taught you all that propaganda about how bad communists were, right? You don't want to be a communist, right? Make more money for me. Do what you're told. That's what we actually taught you to do. Eric wrote, I do know Elon Musk lobbied against some policies that they were planning to have actually have high-speed trains. Yeah. No, this is exactly right. Like, these guys are negative drains. These are negative drains on society. Like, instead of allowing high-speed rail into the society, we ended up with this fucking Hyperloop system that didn't work. June writes, trans women are superior. We're having a superiority contest now with trans women. The reason why the cisoids are trying to exclude us from women's chess teams and sports team and beauty pageants is because we're stronger and smarter and prettier than them. June, I'm going to assume that was said with a little bit of tongue in cheek, but like, you know my position when it comes to trans issues. Just live and let live. Like, do what you want. I do think that there is the, like, I think that it's weird that there's such, like, a heavy narrative surrounding sports, surrounding, like, this whole thing, which is, like, I think it just basically comes down once again to the reality, which was true during the gay rights movement, and I think it's true now, that straight white men are sexually fragile. And they're just very fragile little boys, mainly. And they don't like the idea of looking at a person that they're sexually attracted to, and having it intersect at all with this more complex situation. Like, one of the most interesting facts that I think exists in the trans conversation is that it's red states where trans porn is sought out most. Like, every accusation is a confession. This is absolutely the truth. Every accusation is a confession. And these guys are constantly in a state where they're accusing trans people of this and trans people of that. So what they're confessing is that they love these trans people and that they want to have sex with trans people and that they like jerking off to trans people and that they find it sexually attractive, right? They don't know how to deal with that because they're just scared little fragile little boys who don't want to acknowledge that they want to have a trans girlfriend. Like, that it's the same thing that happened throughout the gay rights movement. You had all of these right wingers who were just like it. You had all these right wingers who were like, gay people are a scourge to our society, and we need to cleanse. Jesus Christ would never want a gay person to exist in our society, right? And then you find out that they're going to like a gay bathhouse. Right? It's just like, it's the people who are the most virulent and the most outspoken and the most aggressive on the issue who are the most guilty. Right? Like, you mark my words. Mark my words. Matt Walsh is going to have a trans sex scandal. It's going to happen where it's going to come out where he has some like trans lover or there's some kind of thing going on there. Because how could it not be the case? Right? Why else would these people be so virulent and so aggressive and so ridiculous if it wasn't for the fact that they're obviously sexually attracted to trans people, but they're uncomfortable with that. And they don't want to look at one another and be like, this is fine, right? This is totally fine, right? What we need is we need James Bond to have sex with a trans woman. And then I think the whole thing will be resolved. And everybody will be like, sure, you'll get those guys who are like, they're trying to shove the trans agenda down our throats. It's the woke trans agenda. But I think there'll be a lot of people who are like, well, I mean, James Bond. You know? It's fucking James Bond. If it's good enough for James Bond, it's good enough for me. Right? Like, I just think people are so up in their own I just think people are so fucking up their own asses about this. It's such a small issue, right? Like, it's such a tiny issue that affects such a small population. But I think it's just like it's just kind of turned into it's turned into like a kind of like it's a fetish. Like, that's what it seems to be. Is that it's like this fascination. People are fetishizing trans people for sure. And it's become like the hot popular thing that any like reasonable society that had its shit together would be like, well, what's a trans person? What are you talking about? Oh, okay. Interesting. All right. Well, that exists. Doesn't affect my life at all. And they go along with the rest of their life. But there's this preoccupation. It's just completely taken people over where they cannot like get over it and they cannot get through it and they dedicate their entire life to it. And everything gets seen through this lens of the trans woke agenda. Like, it's really wild. John Wayne. John Wayne would be hilarious. Is the boy or girl truly a boy or girl in an anime? Yeah, the anime culture loves trans people, of course. Like, just it's because to me it's just like it's just another, like, what I always like to say to people who are anti-trans is like, it turns out that the force of creation is more intelligent and creative than you are. That's all. Like, you had an idea of what human sexuality looked like. You had a conception of what that was like. And it turns out that the universe is just more creative than you. So catch up. Mikhail writes, when people recognize the conversation worth having is about transhumanism instead of transsexualism, that will be when things will move on and start getting somewhere. We'll all become robot people. Beep blorp. It's so true. I remember there's a pastor in Alabama who got caught being a trans woman. Like, yeah, and lots of food of porn online for sure. Like, it's just like we've become it's an obsession. We've become like fascinated by it. And it's, to me, that's the phenomenon that's worth talking about. Because it's such a small issue that affects such a tiny group of people. And trans people are not like when you go out into the world and you walk around the world, every other person is not a trans person. Right? But there's this like mental phenomenon that happens, which is that if you have an obsession with something, if you're dwelling or hyperfixating on something, then you see it everywhere. And your brain blocks out other things. So that, because your brain is like, it's a survival mechanism. It's just sitting there being like, oh, you're hyperfixating on this thing must be trying to kill you. You gotta see this thing, man. This has to be the thing. And so you're constantly seeing it wherever you go. And then you see it in fashion as well. Right? You see it in like, well, this trans person wore this, and here's a who I perceive to be a woman wearing this, or here's a man wearing this, and so that's like this. That's the woke culture infecting our regular culture. It's instead of it just being like, Yeah, a trans person wearing a nice dress because they're allowed to now. Because not that long ago, we literally killed these people, right? Like, not that long ago, we literally killed trans people. And now we don't. And so here they are. So you can see them. And because you're hyper fixated on it with your dumb monkey brain, jerking off to Fuda porn every night, you're just getting yourself all wound up about it. So you see it everywhere. And it's like, oh, they're turning the frogs gay with their woke agenda. Like, and that's what you're turning into. Yeah, 0.6% of the population. It's like a dwindling nothingness. Yeah, I mean, look, and in regards to the pornography conversation, it's not I don't judge people on their more like I don't judge people when it comes to what they want to consume in that regard. Like, I'd say it doesn't matter to me at all. Right? I have a very like what you're going to do is what you're going to do kind of attitude. What you want to do to your own body, how you want to live in your own skin is muy bueno from my perspective. I don't care at all. Right? I think it's the hyperfixation that's so fascinating. It's the hyperfixation that's so fascinating. And like, I do think that there are certain things that people do to themselves that I'm like, why are you doing that? That's an interesting choice, right? And I can like put in a perspective that says like, maybe that's going to cause problems. But at the end of the day, it's your body, it's your consciousness, it's your soul. You know more about yourself than anybody else. You are your own expert. No one else can put feedback onto you that supersedes your own life's experience, because you are the expert of your own consciousness. And anybody that wants to pass any law or do anything to supersede that, I think is a fucking Nazi. Like, get the fuck out of here. No, you can't tell a person how to live their own life, with the one caveat that you can't inflict other people. Like, obviously, like, the reason why murder is such a heinous crime is because you are literally intersecting yourself into another person's life in a permanent manner. Look up Neil Harbison. Neil Harbison. Cyborg artist. Activist for trans species rights. The first person in the world with an antenna implanted in his skull? Ah. The world's first legally recognized cyborg, first cyborg artist. His antenna sends audible vibrations through his skull to report information to him. This includes measurements of electromagnetic radiation, phone calls, and music, as well as videos or images which are translated to audible vibration. His Wi-Fi enabled antenna also allows him to receive signals and data from satellites. He co-founded the Cyborg Foundation, an international organization that defends cyborg rights, promotes cyborg art, and supports people who want to become cyborgs. In 2017, he co-founded the Trans Species Society, an association that gives voice to people with non-human identities, raises awareness of the challenges trans species face, advocates for the freedom of self-design, and offers the development of new senses and organs in community. Yeah, like, here's my position, okay? Like, if you want to do this to yourself, great. If you tell someone that they have to do something like this to themselves, or that they can't do something like this to themselves, fuck you. And I am never going to do this. Like, I will never implant anything inside of myself. I'm not going to get I'm not going to get into any of this kind of stuff, except, and we've got a fellow here on, or a person rather, on Twitch, Tess Dawes. Yeah, stay away from kids and animals. Everything else is okay as long as it's consensual. Well, and the issue is consent. That's what it really comes down to, is that, are people consenting? What does consent mean? Can people consent to what's going on? Like, I would argue very strongly that my number one issue with what's going on with the system of capital is that it is a system that that happens to us without our consent. Like, capitalism is a system, and to pretend as though, as capitalist defenders do, that it's a voluntary system, I think is gaslighting at the highest possible level. A person who requires food and shelter and has that food and shelter withheld from them is not in a position to consent. That I would obviously love to say no to the system of capital, but I'm forced to sell my labor to the system of capital due to my requirement of food and shelter. And so there's an issue where there is a systemic removal of our consent that happens within the capitalist system. And it's that systemization, it's that systemic nature that I'm most focused on most of the time, because I think when people think about consent, it's in a very like one-to-one kind of level of consent. That oh, she said yes, therefore, for not paying any attention whatsoever to any of the larger systems or any of the larger situations that were going on. It gets ethically complicated when it comes to altering the genome and then the effect on future generations, because then your body could become part of my grandkids' body. Yeah, I mean, that's why I do think there is a complexity when it comes to the issue of consent. My feeling is more or less that like the universe is a much more powerful force than we are, by a lot, by a significant margin. And very clearly humans are going to endeavor to fuck around. And we are going to find out, right? And the fuck around aspect of it will always catch up people. There will always be unintended consequences, which is why I feel like there is a lot of which is why I think free market thinking is such an abomination. Because free market thinking doesn't permit actual sober conversation, philosophical talk, or communication. It doesn't really allow you to move forward soberly, right? It's just basically saying rich assholes do whatever you want and everybody just deal with the consequences of it. And that's fine because they were rich assholes. Yeah. No. An animal or a child does not have or qualify consent. That's absolutely truth. Like that's like, yeah, that's the absolute beating heart of consent. Like, and of course this raises the question of when does a person have consent, and that's a because to a certain degree, like nobody asked to be here, right? Like, I didn't give my consent to be alive, for example. I'm just here. Here I am. And so whatever force is generating us and creating us doesn't require our consent or supersedes our consent to a great deal, right? Like that's the most interesting thing. And of course, what psychos will do then is be like, well, if we were created without consent, and so why do I need to get somebody's consent because I'm God? Anyway, yeah, consent is a very interesting. Yeah, the human experience brought you to a certain point. No, exactly. Like, well, and we need to have like open communication about it constantly. To in my view, because like I think one of the things that it pays to remember is like a lot of our laws and a lot of the things that were created by rich white aristocrats and slaveholders, right? So I think it's always good to, like, I don't think any of these laws should be considered sacrosanct. And we should constantly be in a communication of like what it is we expect and what kind of society we want to have. But we don't live in a society that respects law. Like we're a very anti-law society. We're a very chaos-driven society. We don't respect laws. We don't respect authority. Certainly not. That's why we say, like, if a society starts passing laws and expects people to follow those laws, they're authoritarian, right? That's the language that we use. We say that they're authoritarian because they've passed laws and expect people to follow those laws. Whereas we here in the West do not respect laws whatsoever. We believe in what we call a free market, which is essentially no different than saying let chaos reign, this worship of chaos that we have. And so anybody can do anything they want anytime, anywhere, at any moment. And if you attempt to pass a law, then you're getting in the way of the free market, right? And so it's very, very difficult in a society that does not respect laws at all, like zero respect for laws whatsoever, in a society that's based on these precepts and these principles of chaos. It's very difficult to have rational, reasonable conversations with people and expect those rational, reasonable conversations to be taken seriously, right? And we need to protect the innocent, but it's very clear that the ruling structure that we have doesn't give a fuck about that at all, right? The very existence of Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile ring and like the Catholic Church's pedophile rings shows you that the rich don't give a fuck about this at all. They don't care about laws. They don't care about societal norms. They don't care at all. And it's the system of capital that's generating these things. It's the system of capital that's generating this inability of our ruling society to exist by law or by social norms, because we've sacrificed everything at the altar of capital, and we worship chaos. We're chaos death knights, which is why we have people like Stephen Bonnell. I'm really gonna put it to all of you guys, okay, straight up. When it comes to this weirdo Destiny, this little creep Destiny, his name is Stephen Bonnell. StephenBonnall or ELL. I don't give a fuck. Spell his name wrong. I don't give a shit. His name is Stephen Bonnell. His name is not Destiny. Okay? Destiny is something like a creepy little 6-year-old names himself and then goes around telling people, my name's Destiny. I'm a superhero. Like, it's a weird little branding superhero name. Right? His name is Stephen Bonnell. We are going to completely defang this person because he is a genocidal maniac walking around with a fan club of genocidal maniacs pretending to be like super cool, like Destiny. Are you kidding me? Stephen Bonnell. Goodbye, Destiny. We're killing that. It is dead now. So Stephen Bonnell, creepy little weirdo, pro-genocidal maniac. Yeah, this is why we end up with these guys who say they care about international law and what the ICJ rulings say. Yeah, he doesn't care what the ICJ says. Like, he made that really clear. Like, he doesn't give two shits what the ICJ has to say. Like, these pro-genocidal maniacs are just in support of whatever is going to support their mania, right? Like, see, my dad's name is Steven. Yeah, that's fine. Right? But it's Steven. That's the good kind of Steven. I shouldn't say that. There's probably a bunch of Stevens listening right now being like, oh, oh, oh. Yeah, he's the I speak English fast, ergo I am smart prototype. He's like Ben Shapiro. He and Ben Shapiro are essentially intellectual peers with one another. They don't really disagree on anything. I think my favorite thing that happened recently with Bonnell is that he was on his stream, and his mom came on the stream, and they started talking about Cuba, and she's a Cuban expat, right? She fled from Cuba with her family when Fidel Castro took over, right? And she started talking about her life in Cuba, and she revealed straight up that her family owned plantations. She almost said the word slave. There's this moment where she actually says, yeah, we had, and she goes, and then stops, and then like looks at her son and kind of giggles, and like gets up and leaves. So they had slaves on a plantation, and Fidel Castro chased them off the island so that they could flee to America. And so Bonnell is a Gusano. He's the son of Gusanos, and he's a creepy genocide, pro-genocide supporting Gusano loser with a fan base he got because he was good at StarCraft while playing in his parents' basement, his Gusano parents' basement, because they made a whole bunch of money from their slave plantations. That's Bonnell's life. That's how he built his life. From literal slave money earned from Cuban slaves, allowing him to sit in a basement and play StarCraft. And we're supposed to listen to this guy? We're supposed to listen to this Gusano? Get the fuck out of here with this shit. Like, just trash. Ugh. Well, with that, I'm gonna close it down for the day. We've made it. Always remember, guys, each and every one of you is a quantum being walking around in quantum energy. These billionaires are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the hopes you'll never realize it. You'll just stay the good little commodity they need you to be. Rebel. Revolt. Repent. Good luck. We're going to need it.